Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're crossing the Atlantic, back to the old country, Sicily, because this is the story of a man who brought the Mafia full circle. A quiet figure who rose from the shadows of Palermo to the throne of the Gambino crime family. His name? Domenico Cefalù, Italian Dom, the boss who rebuilt the family's Sicilian soul. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love watching this global underworld of listeners come alive, city by city, midnight by midnight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss a story from Outlaw Icons, where every whisper hides a legend. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and step back into the Sicilian shadows, where bloodlines, loyalty, and silence still rule. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Sicilian Origins. The sea off Palermo is a strange color at dawn, blue and gray tangled together like old memories that refuse to fade. Fishermen say the water remembers everything. Blood, salt, secrets. In January of 1947, when the air still carried the echo of war and poverty, hung over the island like a stubborn ghost, a child named Domenico Cefalù was born into that world of silence and survival. Nobody could have guessed then that he would one day rise to command one of America's most feared crime families. But even as a baby, the sounds of that place, the arguing men in the piazza, the church bells, the whispers about who owed who, began shaping the rhythm of his soul. Palermo in those years was a city scarred and tired. Bombed-out buildings still leaned against each other like wounded soldiers. Men without work gathered in doorways, eyes sharp for any chance, legal or not. Women carried baskets heavier than they should have, and boys learned early that the world was not fair, only divided, between those who obeyed and those who were obeyed. Domenico's family, like many Sicilians, kept to themselves. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't trust easily. In post-war Sicily, words could kill as quickly as bullets. And so, silence became both a shield and a language. His father worked hard for little. His mother, devout and weary, prayed for stability. But in those streets, there was another kind of faith, one that didn't wear robes or carry rosaries. The Mafia wasn't something people joined. It was something they breathed. It was everywhere and nowhere, woven into daily life like the smell of bread from a morning bakery. It promised order in a world of chaos, justice in a land where the law belonged to whoever had the most fear behind him. To young Domenico, that shadow power must have looked almost sacred. Men who were respected, men who could make things happen with a single word. He grew up watching them from a distance. The ones in press suits who walked into bars and never paid. The ones everyone greeted with half-smiles and lowered eyes. They weren't movie gangsters. They were flesh and bone reminders of how power actually worked. To them, honor was currency, and loyalty was more binding than blood. And in that environment, a boy like Domenico learned quickly. He learned that patience was strength, that listening could be deadlier than shouting, and that the most dangerous men were often the quietest ones. Sicily in the 50s was bleeding people. Every ship that left for America carried away another family chasing survival across the ocean. To the old, it looked like surrender. To the young, it looked like hope. Domenico watched friends disappear to foreign shores, returning only in letters filled with talk of dollars and skyscrapers and streets that never slept. Palermo had begun to feel smaller, its promises shrinking with every passing year. Opportunity was for the bold or the connected, and he, for all his calm exterior, had both ambition and the instincts of someone born to navigate shadows. By his teenage years, the world around him was changing. The Mafia wars of the island had turned bloodier, more chaotic. Bombings, shootings, and betrayals became part of the local rhythm. Men were disappearing, swallowed by vendettas no one dared to speak about. Domenico watched it all with a cold kind of awareness. He saw that survival didn't belong to those who shouted loudest, but to those who moved unseen. It was a lesson he would never forget. The old men who ran things in Palermo noticed boys like him. Quiet, dependable, respectful. In a land where loose talk could bury you, those were rare traits. He wasn't the kind to draw attention. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble loudly, didn't brag about what he knew. But behind that calm exterior was a calculating mind, one that weighed every glance, every silence, every deal. The streets had taught him that power wasn't always about violence. Sometimes it was about who could wait longer before speaking. And yet, for all the lessons Sicily offered, the island also held limits. Domenico wanted more than the routine of small-town schemes and endless deference to aging dons. The whispers of America, especially New York, were everywhere. Stories of cousins who'd gone there and found a new kind of life. A place where Sicilians weren't peasants or pawns, but kings in suits. The Gambinos, the Luccheses, the Genovese, those names carried weight even in distant Palermo. It was said that New York was a place where the old mafia codes had been reborn in gold and neon. To a man like Domenico, that sounded like destiny calling. By the late 70s, he made the decision that would change everything. He would leave. For men like him, there was no fanfare, no tearful goodbye. You packed your life in silence and stepped onto a ship with your head down, one among many dreamers chasing something they couldn't quite name. The crossing was long, and the ocean felt endless. Each wave seemed to erase a piece of the old world. The crumbling streets of Palermo, the smell of citrus groves, the faces that had defined his youth. Ahead lay New York, a city built on reinvention and risk. When the skyline finally appeared, glittering through a haze of mist and smoke, it must have felt unreal. The Statue of Liberty stood in the distance like a promise. But to men like Cefalu, promises were only as good as the power behind them. He stepped onto American soil, not as a tourist, but as a man on a mission. He didn't come to blend in. He came to belong, to something ancient, familiar, and dangerous. Brooklyn in the late 70s was a patchwork of old, ethnic strongholds. Italians still ran the bakeries, the delis, the docks. But beneath the laughter and the Sunday dinners, a darker current pulsed. The American Mafia was changing, but its roots, especially the Sicilian ones, ran deep. They called themselves Zips, Sicilian-born men who had crossed the ocean to strengthen the families in New York. They brought with them a colder discipline, a purer code, and a memory of the old ways. Domenico fit among them like a puzzle piece that had finally found its place. He found work, at least on paper, in legitimate trades. Construction, trucking, imports, the usual camouflage for men who needed to keep a foot in two worlds. Those early years in New York taught him that survival here wasn't just about toughness. It was about control. The city was loud, fast, reckless. But Domenico stayed the same, silent, deliberate, unreadable. They started calling him Italian Dom behind his back, a mix of respect and quiet fear. He didn't demand loyalty. He inspired it by never asking too much, by never revealing more than he had to. Still, even in a new land, the ghosts of Sicily followed him. The Mafia had always been about bloodlines, not just family ties, but heritage. Being Sicilian wasn't just a matter of geography. It was a mark of authenticity. In a world where American-born mobsters were becoming flashy, careless, and loud, the Sicilians represented the old guard, men who believed in tradition, secrecy, and quiet ruthlessness. Domenico carried that torch naturally. He was a reminder of where it all began, an echo of a time when the Mafia didn't crave headlines, only respect. There are moments in a man's life when the past and future stand side by side, waiting for his choice. For Domenico, that moment came in the unremarkable corners of Brooklyn, smoky cafes where old Sicilians met, whispered in dialect, and mapped out invisible empires. He wasn't a soldier yet, not officially, but the men around him saw potential. He had the calmness of someone who understood danger, not from movies, but from life itself. And that calmness was magnetic. He never raised his voice, never argued, never acted out of impulse. When trouble came, and in that world, trouble always came, Domenico didn't flinch. He watched, listened, waited, and somehow, things always seemed to resolve in his favor. It was said he could make an enemy disappear without leaving fingerprints, not because he pulled a trigger, but because he understood how to make time itself do the killing. Patience as a weapon. That patience became his legend long before he had title. He wasn't trying to be feared. He was trying to last. In the Mafia, survival was the rarest kind of victory. Every loudmouth gangster eventually met a headline and a coffin. Domenico was building something quieter, a foundation no one could see, but everyone would feel. The Sicilian code had crossed the ocean with him, and he was determined to live by it. By now, his parents' letters from Palermo spoke of age and fading health. Sicily was still there, unchanging, beautiful in its decay. But Domenico no longer belonged to it. The island had made him, yes, taught him how to listen to silence, how to wear humility like armor. But America was his future. The Gambino family, though he wasn't yet deep within its ranks, represented the next evolution of the old Sicilian dream. Power disguised as respectability, influence hidden beneath everyday life. He began to move closer to the inner circle. Introductions led to meetings, meetings to favors, favors to debts repaid in loyalty. Always quiet, always precise. Men twice his size deferred to him, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. No one could quite read him, and that made him dangerous. To the old bosses, he was a bridge between generations. To the younger ones, he was an enigma they couldn't afford to underestimate. And through it all, Domenico never spoke more than necessary. He understood the oldest truth of the underworld, that noise draws attention, and attention brings death. In every bar, every backroom, every whispered deal, his silence spoke louder than threats ever could. Those who underestimated him tended not to last long in positions of trust. Sometimes, late at night, he must have thought of Palermo, the cracked walls, the sea breeze, the smell of orange blossoms drifting through narrow alleys. It wasn't nostalgia. It was reminder. Every success he found in New York was rooted in that island upbringing, in the hard lessons of survival learned under the Sicilian sun. The Mafia, for all its American glamour, still owed its soul to Sicily. And Domenico Cefalù was living proof of that, a man carrying an ancient code into a modern world. By the end of the 70s, the pieces were in place. He had the discipline, the reputation, and the quiet authority that men in his world recognized instinctively. The American dream, for him, wasn't freedom, it was control, a seat at the table, a legacy that reached from Palermo's dusty streets to the heart of New York's criminal empire. Yet destiny, in this world, is never gentle. The very silence that kept him alive would soon become the reason everyone wanted to know who he really was. Behind every calm smile was a calculation. Behind every handshake, a test. And behind every promise, a hidden cost waiting to be paid. The boy from Palermo had crossed the ocean and vanished into America's shadows. But in the underworld's invisible hierarchy, a storm was brewing, one that would call him out of the quiet and into the center of power. And when that moment came, Domenico Cefalù would remind everyone that silence is the loudest weapon of all. Chapter 2: Arrival in America and Early Involvement. The docks of New York were never truly quiet. Even at night, when the city's roar dulled into a distant hum, the waterfront breathed like a restless animal. The groan of ships, the clang of steel, the low chatter of men hustling for the next paycheck or the next score. When Domenico Cefalù arrived, the skyline didn't look like freedom. It looked like opportunity, raw, loud, dangerous. He stepped off that ship with the same calm that had defined him since Sicily, the same expressionless gaze that made others uneasy. To most, he was just another immigrant, one more nameless face chasing the American dream. But Domenico hadn't come for dreams. He had come for structure, for the familiar rhythm of the underworld. hidden beneath the noise of modern life. He found Brooklyn first. The borough was thick with the smell of bread, gasoline, and tension. Italians still ran the streets in certain neighborhoods. Men whose fathers had fled Sicily or Naples decades before, men who built lives in the shadows because the sunlight never quite trusted them. On corners, old women sold pastries while pretending not to see the men in suits who passed envelopes by the benches. Everyone knew the game, even those who claimed they didn't. The Mafia wasn't an organization here. It was a culture, a second bloodstream running under the city's veins. And for someone like Domenico, that current pulled hard. He rented a room in a crowded tenement, where walls were thin and conversations softer still. Every night, he'd listen to the sounds of laughter, of argument, of the occasional sudden silence that told him something important had just passed between neighbors. He didn't rush into anything. That wasn't his way. Men who ran headfirst into the life rarely lasted long. Domenico waited, learning the unspoken map of Brooklyn, which bars were safe, which blocks belonged to which family, who was moving money and who was moving mouths. In the underworld, information was oxygen, and he was already breathing deep. The late 70s were a strange time for the Mafia in New York. The old guard, men who'd built empires on prohibition, gambling, and union control, were aging. The new generation was louder, flashier, more American. They wore designer suits and craved headlines, forgetting the one rule Sicily had always taught: power survives in silence. Domenico watched these changes like a patient surgeon studying a sickness. He didn't criticize. He simply waited for the right body to operate on. Through acquaintances, old friends from Palermo, men who'd made their way across the Atlantic years earlier, he found connections to the so-called Zip crew. They were the Sicilians of the Gambino family, immigrants like him who had earned a reputation for being colder, more disciplined, less predictable than their American-born counterparts. The Americans respected them, but they didn't fully understand them. To them, the Zips were ghosts, men who appeared when money needed to move or enemies needed to vanish. They spoke a dialect no one could follow and answered to codes no one dared question. Domenico fit perfectly. He didn't drink much, didn't chase women recklessly, didn't talk unless necessary. In a world of peacocks, he was a shadow. He began working under one of the Sicilian crews, men who operated in quiet corners of construction, trucking, and import businesses. They handled everything from shipments of olive oil to shipments of things no customs officer ever logged. To the authorities, they were just another group of hard-working immigrants. To the streets, they were a whisper of something ancient. His first real test came quietly. A job had gone wrong, a shipment miscounted, a middleman talking more than he should. The crew was angry, arguments flared, and there were whispers that someone needed to handle it. Domenico said little. When others debated, he listened. When others threatened, he waited. And when the time came, he solved the problem not with violence, but with precision. He spoke to the right people, promised nothing, hinted everything. Within a week, the problem disappeared. No blood, no noise, just resolution. That was his introduction. The men above noticed. They didn't need explanations. They valued results. They began trusting him with small responsibilities, collecting, watching, managing introductions. Each task was a test, and he passed each one by staying invisible. He understood the delicate balance of fear and respect that ruled their world. Push too hard, and you make enemies. Stay too soft, and you become prey. Domenico stayed in the middle, a ghost with a pulse. He started working with Pasquale Cani, a fellow Sicilian with deep ties to the Gambino hierarchy. Cani was respected, a man of structure, a believer in the old ways. Under him, Domenico learned how business in America operated, how rackets were no longer just about muscle, but about control over unions, bids, and legitimate fronts. The Mafia had evolved, trading guns for briefcases, bullets for paperwork. And Domenico adapted with frightening ease. He wasn't just following orders. He was learning the architecture of power itself. The streets of Brooklyn were alive with politics. Crews from the five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, all jostled for territory, alliances, and survival. But Domenico's loyalty never wavered. He was Gambino, through and through, though he carried Sicily in his blood like a quiet promise. Men began calling him Italian Dom. It wasn't meant as mockery. It was recognition. He was different from the Americans. Colder, quieter, more deliberate. And in that difference, he earned his first true reputation. What set him apart wasn't brutality. It was restraint. In a life where violence was currency, he spent it sparingly. The few who crossed him learned that lesson the hard way. They disappeared not in storms of gunfire, but in silence, like stones slipping beneath black water. People said he had a gift. He could make chaos vanish without lifting his voice. It wasn't magic. It was control, the kind of control that frightened even the men who claimed to fear nothing. His days followed a rhythm. Mornings spent in quiet meetings over espresso. Afternoons inspecting warehouses, construction sites, ports. Nights reserved for conversation, the kind that never left the table. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it carried weight. Men leaned in when he spoke, even if he said very little. There was an aura about him, an invisible pressure that made people measure their words twice. He had the patience of a priest and the memory of a ledger. Every favor owed, every debt repaid. He cataloged them without needing paper. Behind that calm presence, though, was ambition. Not the kind that shouted for attention, but the kind that waited, steady as a fuse. He didn't crave fame like John Gotti or wealth like the old Dons. What he wanted was legacy, the power to shape something that would last longer than he would. He was playing a game with no finish line, and he was already thinking several moves ahead. Law enforcement at the time barely knew his name. They were busy chasing the flashy targets, the Gotti types, the ones who loved cameras and clubs. Domenico moved through the cracks of their vision. He worked legitimate jobs, paid taxes, smiled politely when necessary. If they ever asked questions, he had answers. He understood that invisibility was the ultimate weapon in a city full of watchers. The Sicilian crews thrived during those years. They managed their operations with quiet efficiency, funneling profits through legitimate fronts, keeping violence low and discipline high. Domenico's role grew with them. By the early 80s, he was handling delicate negotiations, disputes over contracts, territory, and loyalty. In a world defined by betrayal, he had become the rare constant. But nothing in the mafia stays stable for long. The heroin trade had exploded, pulling in money like gravity pulls stars. Some of the Sicilians were deeply involved in the smuggling routes from Italy to the U.S., and whispers of those connections floated through every backroom conversation. Domenico, too, became tangled in that web, not as a street dealer, but as a facilitator, someone who ensured shipments moved smoothly, that people stayed quiet, that profits reached the right hands. It was dangerous work. One mistake could mean prison or worse. Yet he never seemed worried. He treated risk the way other men treated weather, inevitable, but manageable. In 1982, that calm was tested. Authorities cracked down on a major smuggling ring, and Domenico's name surfaced. The indictment came like a distant thunderclap, not unexpected, but still jarring. For the first time, the quiet man from Palermo faced the weight of American justice. They charged him, convicted him, and sent him to prison for 6 years. 6 years, a lifetime in the underworld, where loyalty could evaporate overnight. But in prison, Domenico did something few could manage. He disappeared again. Not literally, but spiritually. He didn't complain, didn't boast, didn't talk. He read. He observed. He earned respect the hard way, by keeping his mouth shut when others spilled everything for a deal. The silence that had defined him became his armor. Even the guards noticed. They said he had the eyes of a man who already knew how the story would end. The world outside changed while he was inside. Alliances shifted, faces vanished, and new players took the stage. But Domenico's reputation, instead of fading, hardened into legend. Men in the Gambino family spoke his name quietly, as if afraid the walls might repeat it. When he was released, he returned not as a broken man, but as something more dangerous, a man who had proven he could endure. In the Mafia, endurance was the highest currency. He re-entered Brooklyn with the same steady pace he'd always had. No dramatic reunion, no celebration. He simply resumed life as if 6 years had been a brief vacation. Those who tried to test him quickly realized nothing had changed. If anything, he was sharper, more focused, more certain of his path. He reconnected with old allies, found new footholds, and re-established his place in the hierarchy without ever raising his voice. By the late 80s, Domenico had become part of the family's inner fabric. He wasn't yet a boss or even a capo, but he was trusted, deeply trusted. The Sicilian faction saw in him the embodiment of everything they valued: silence, discipline, loyalty. He was the antidote to the chaos that had infected the American Mafia. And in those smoke-filled rooms where power shifted quietly, his name began circulating as someone to watch. The Gambino family, then under John Gotti's flashy reign, was living loudly, too loudly for the old-school men. Cameras followed suits and smiles, headlines screamed about the Dapper Don, and the FBI tightened its grip. But beneath that circus, Domenico represented something older, a reminder of when the Mafia was a secret society, not a spectacle. The contrast made him invaluable. He was the balance point between two eras, one burning itself out in fame, and another waiting patiently in the dark for the noise to die. He met with Pasquale Conti again, a mentor and mirror of his own quiet strength. Conti's trust opened doors that others spent years knocking on. Through him, Domenico navigated higher levels of the Gambino operation, learning the unspoken rules of leadership. That true authority isn't declared, it's recognized. Men followed him not because they had to, but because they wanted to. In a world built on fear, he inspired something rarer: respect. There were whispers that Domenico would be formally inducted, made official in the eyes of the family. When that ceremony finally happened, it was simple, sacred, bound by blood and silence. No lights, no fanfare, just men swearing loyalty under the shadow of centuries-old vows. It was the moment every mafioso lived for, but for Domenico, it was just another step. Not a coronation, but confirmation. He had crossed from Sicily's poverty into New York's underworld, and found his place without ever betraying who he was. By the time the decade turned, his future was sealed. The boy who'd once watched powerful men from Palermo's street corners had become one of them, though his power didn't come from noise or spectacle. It came from stillness, from the way he occupied a room without needing to speak. In him, the Mafia's oldest soul had found new breath. The city around him never slept, but Domenico did not rush. Every movement, every word, every look carried intention. Those who mistook his silence for weakness didn't make the mistake twice. And those who understood him knew one truth: he was not building toward a single moment of glory. He was building an empire of quiet endurance. And yet, even as his star rose, trouble was brewing, a storm that would test everything he had learned. The law had not forgotten him. The streets were shifting again, younger men eager to prove themselves, older bosses desperate to hold on. It was the kind of chaos that devoured entire families. But Domenico Cefalù had survived Sicily. He had survived prison, and he had learned to weaponize patience itself. The next chapter of his life would drag him deeper into the labyrinth, where loyalty, betrayal, and silence would all blur into one. And somewhere in that maze, the quiet man from Palermo would begin his final ascent toward the seat of power that so many had died reaching for. Chapter 3: First Arrests and Prison Time. The knock on the door came just before dawn, the kind of hour when silence is heavy and every sound feels amplified. Domenico Cefalù didn't flinch. He had been awake for an hour already, sipping bitter espresso in the dim light of his kitchen, the morning air still thick with the scent of cigarette smoke. Outside, engines idled. Boots shuffled. A voice called his name. Official, detached, the voice of a man who already knew what was waiting inside. The arrests had begun. And for the first time in years, Domenico understood that the quiet life he'd built in Brooklyn was about to collide head-on with the reality he'd always known would come. The law had finally found its way to his door. When the agents pushed inside, they found him calm, dressed, collected. No shouting, no resistance, no fear. Just those unreadable eyes, the same eyes that had unnerved men far more dangerous than the ones standing before him. They said his name like it was a discovery, but to him, it was just a formality. He had been expecting this. Not the timing, not the method, but the inevitability. In the underworld, the question was never if the law would come, only when. As they let him out in handcuffs, the neighborhood watched through half-drawn curtains. Mothers whispered. Old men shook their heads, but said nothing. Everyone in that part of Brooklyn knew what Domenico was, or at least what he wasn't. He wasn't a thief, he wasn't a street brawler, and he wasn't a fool. He was something rarer, a man who commanded quiet respect without needing to demand it. The whispers that morning were filled with confusion more than judgment. What had he done? Who had betrayed him? The details didn't matter. In that world, everyone eventually faced the music, even those who wrote it. The charges were heavy. Heroin trafficking, a network stretching from Sicily to New York, hidden inside the arteries of legitimate trade. The kind of operation that required intelligence, coordination, and nerve. Three things Domenico possessed in abundance. The government had been watching for years, building a case brick by brick, wiretap by wiretap, until they believed they had enough to break him. But what they didn't understand was that a man like Cefalu wasn't easily broken. In the courtroom, he looked like anything but a criminal mastermind. No tailored suits, no flashy jewelry, no arrogance. Just simplicity, pressed shirt, dark tie, expression unreadable. The prosecutors painted him as a ghost in the machine, a man who made others move, but left no fingerprints of his own. To them, he was a shadowy link between Sicily's old Cosa Nostra and America's new underworld. To Domenico, it was all theater, men talking about things they only half understood, trying to define a world that existed in whispers, not paperwork. When the verdict came, guilty, he didn't react. The reporters expected outrage, a curse, some trace of anger. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that the game had gone as far as it could for now. 6 years. That was the sentence. For others, it would have been a death sentence of a different kind. 6 years away from money, power, control. But Domenico saw it differently. In a world obsessed with noise, prison was silence. And silence, to him, was familiar. The gates clanged shut behind him with a finality that might have broken lesser men. Inside, the air smelled of metal, sweat, and boredom. Prison was its own ecosystem, hierarchies, politics, codes. To survive, you had to choose your place quickly. But Domenico didn't need to choose. Men sensed something in him, the way animals sense weather before a storm. He wasn't loud or violent, but there was a steadiness that drew respect without asking for it. Even the guards treated him with a cautious politeness. He kept to himself, speaking only when spoken to. Days blended into each other. The same concrete walls, the same tasteless meals, the same distant hum of human confinement. Yet within that monotony, Domenico thrived. He treated the place like a monastery, not a cage. Each day became an exercise in observation. He studied people, their weaknesses, their patterns, their tells. He learned who could be trusted, who couldn't, and who thought they were smarter than they were. Some inmates bragged about what they'd done, boasting as if their crimes were trophies. Domenico never joined them. The few who tried to draw him out quickly realized that his silence wasn't shyness, it was dominance. In prison, talk was cheap, and words got you killed. He understood that the most valuable thing a man could control was his tongue. When others traded stories for respect, Domenico earned it by saying nothing. Letters came from the outside, some from distant family, others from associates who used careful language to avoid the attention of watchful eyes. The world kept moving without him, but pieces of information slipped through. The Gambino family was changing. John Gotti's rise had turned the Mafia into a media circus. Cameras followed his every move. The suits were flashier, the headlines bolder, the code weaker. Domenico read those stories with quiet disgust. The old ways were fading, honor replaced by ego, discretion replaced by arrogance. And though he was locked behind bars, he knew that when he got out, there would still be room for a man like him. He found solace in routine. Each morning, he'd wake before dawn, the same as he had in Palermo. He'd stretch, drink bitter coffee from a metal cup, and sit in silence while the others slept or cursed. He treated the noise of prison like background music to a meditation. Every day, he trained his mind to focus on patience, on observation, on endurance. Prison was supposed to break you. Instead, it refined him, like steel through fire. Occasionally, he'd meet other men from the life, soldiers, captains, sometimes even bosses fallen from grace. They'd test him with words, probing, trying to measure his loyalty. He gave them nothing but politeness and neutrality. Inside those walls, alliances could be as deadly as betrayals. But news of his silence traveled fast. The Gambinos heard it. The Sicilians heard it. Even in confinement, his reputation was growing. He wasn't just surviving. He was becoming myth. In the quiet hours of night, when the lights dimmed and the whispers softened, he would think about Sicily, not with nostalgia, but with calculation. He'd remember the smell of wet stone after rain, the cracked walls of old houses, the sound of the sea gnawing at the cliffs. That island had taught him everything he needed to survive here. In Sicily, you learned to wait. In Sicily, revenge didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be certain. And he was certain that the world outside would still have a place for him when the gates opened again. There were moments when others tried to test his calm. Younger inmates, full of adrenaline and stupidity, thought silence was weakness. One afternoon, in the yard, a man approached him, tall, angry, itching for recognition. He said something crude, something designed to provoke. Domenico looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up, walked closer, and said one word, barely above a whisper. Whatever that word was, it drained the color from the man's face. He walked away without another sound. No one asked what had been said. They didn't need to. Some men command authority with fists. Domenico did it with eyes. The years passed slowly, but not wasted. Every day behind bars was another lesson in discipline. Every hour in silence made his mind sharper, his instincts cleaner. When release finally came, it was without ceremony. The guards opened the gate, and he stepped into the light with the same composure he had walked in with years earlier. The world outside had changed, but Domenico hadn't. He had become harder to read, more careful, more dangerous in his quiet way. The men who picked him up from the gate didn't ask questions. They drove in silence, just as he preferred. Brooklyn looked different. New buildings, new faces, but the same undercurrent of control, fear, and ambition. The Mafia was still alive, just more cautious now. His absence had been noticed, his return anticipated. In the Underworld, silence could make you disappear, but it could also make you legendary. He went back to work as if no time had passed. No bitterness, no grand re-entry, just steady movement. Those who met him after prison said he seemed colder, more deliberate. If he'd been quiet before, now he was almost spectral. He spoke only when absolutely necessary. When he did, people listened. There was something unnerving about his stillness, like a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to make it his ally. The FBI watched from a distance, unsure what to make of him. He wasn't a showman like Gotti, wasn't sloppy like some of the younger captains. He worked behind layers of legitimacy. Companies, contracts, old country relationships that couldn't be traced with wiretaps. The agents called him low profile, but inside the family, they called him something else, reliable. In a world built on betrayal, reliability was the rarest and most valuable currency. Old friends welcomed him back cautiously. Prison changes everyone. But they soon realized that Domenico hadn't changed. He had evolved. His priorities were clearer. His tolerance for mistakes thinner. The old Sicilian discipline had crystallized into something colder, almost mathematical. Every move he made now was strategic. Every conversation calculated for effect. The men who worked with him said it felt like he could see 2 steps into the future. He didn't gamble. He didn't guess. He waited until the outcome was certain, and then he acted. He reconnected with Pasquale Cani, the man who had once opened the door to the Gambino hierarchy. Cani had survived his own storms, and the 2 men's reunion felt less like friendship and more like the quiet merging of 2 currents. Together, they began rebuilding influence, one connection at a time, one favor at a time. Domenico's experience in prison had taught him how to move without leaving traces, how to operate in the cracks between law and rumor. Around this time, he was brought in for questioning again, not about new crimes, but about old ones. Prosecutors were trying to reopen cases, to pressure him into testifying against others. They thought time had softened him, that prison had made him pliable. They were wrong. When he sat in front of the grand jury, he said nothing, not a word. The silence stretched, heavy and defiant. The judge warned him. The prosecutors threatened him. He simply looked back with that same expressionless calm. Eventually, they charged him with contempt. He served the time without complaint. To the outside world, it was stubbornness. To the Mafia, it was proof of faith. That silence earned him more than respect. It earned him status. In the world he belonged to, talking to law enforcement was the ultimate sin. By refusing, even under pressure, Domenico became a symbol, the man who would never bend. The old-timers loved him for it. The younger ones feared him. He had become the embodiment of the code they all pretended to live by. When he returned from that contempt sentence, his position within the Gambino family was stronger than ever. He wasn't a boss yet. That would come later. But he was no longer just a soldier. He was a counselor, an advisor, a quiet force behind decisions that shaped the family's future. He represented a bridge between eras, the last breath of the old Sicilian code and the first whisper of the modern mafia's adaptation. His old cellmates would have been surprised to see it. The man who walked out of prison with nothing had returned to a world ready to hand him power. But Domenico didn't gloat. He didn't rush. He never did. Every move was a whisper, not a shout. Every gain was hidden behind layers of invisibility. The newspapers still wrote about louder names, but inside the family, everyone knew who truly held influence. And yet, he never forgot the lesson of confinement. Freedom, he had learned, was fragile, a privilege that could vanish with one careless mistake. So he built his empire the way a mason builds a wall, stone by stone, measured and patient. He trusted few, spoke less, and never lost the stillness that had carried him through prison. By the late 80s, he was known as one of the most disciplined men in the Mafia. He didn't drink in public, didn't draw attention, didn't leave fingerprints, literal or metaphorical. His life was a study in restraint. Every decision was calculated, every alliance weighed, and through that restraint, he became indispensable. The bosses came and went. Domenico remained. But beneath the calm, he knew the future would test him again. Power attracts attention, and attention is poison in the underworld. The law was changing. The FBI was learning. Wiretaps were everywhere. Informants were multiplying. The Mafia was shrinking under the weight of its own noise. And in that chaos, men like Cefalu, quiet, old school, invisible, became rarer, more valuable, and more dangerous. As the 90s approached, he could sense the next storm forming. Another arrest, another test, another chance to prove that silence, once again, would outlast everything else. He didn't know when it would come, but he was ready, because Domenico Cefalù had learned the truth that few men ever grasp. That survival in this life wasn't about power or fear. It was about control. Control over others. Control over fate. And, most of all, control over yourself. And when the next door came crashing down, he would meet it the same way he always had, eyes calm, heart steady, words measured. The world could scream all it wanted. He would answer with silence. Chapter 4. Induction and Rise Within the Gambino Family. The night he was made, the world outside was quiet. No fireworks, no parades, no grand declarations of power. Just a handful of men gathered in a dimly lit basement, their voices low, their faces lit by the flicker of a single bulb. Domenico Cefalù stood among them, calm as always, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp. This was not a moment for celebration. It was a vow. In that world, to be made was to cross an invisible line, one that separated ordinary men from those bound forever by blood and silence. For Domenico, it wasn't a dream fulfilled. It was inevitability, the next step in a life built on patience, control, and quiet precision. He had already proven himself beyond question. The years after his first prison sentence had shaped him into something harder, cleaner, more deliberate. The family had watched, tested him, waited to see if prison had softened him or strengthened him. What they saw was a man who returned without bitterness or complaint, who resumed business like nothing had happened. He didn't chase power. He let it come to him. And that, more than anything, made him dangerous in the best possible way. The Gambino family, fractured, loud, and uncertain under the changing winds of the 80s, needed men like him. Men who remembered the old ways. Men who could bring order back to a world that had become addicted to chaos. The induction ceremony itself was simple but sacred. A small car with a saint's image, pricked fingers, a candle's flame. Words spoken in Sicilian, words older than the country itself. Loyalty, obedience, silence. Domenico repeated them without hesitation. When the oath ended, he wasn't just another soldier. He was part of something ancient, something that stretched back across the ocean to the dusty streets of Palermo, to the very roots of his existence. For a man like him, this wasn't crime. It was heritage. After the ceremony, the men congratulated him quietly. There was no backslapping, no laughter, just nods of approval, subtle gestures of acknowledgement. Pasquale Cani, his mentor and a respected captain, put a hand on his shoulder and whispered something only Domenico could hear. Whatever it was, it made him nod once, slowly. That was how it began, his official life within the Gambino family, not as an outsider or an observer, but as one of its chosen few. The early days of his induction were not marked by sudden wealth or reckless indulgence. Domenico understood that being made didn't mean freedom, it meant duty. He now belonged entirely to the family. Every dollar earned, every favor granted, every silence kept was in service of something larger. He approached this new chapter the way he approached everything, methodically, with restraint. He built his crew quietly, surrounding himself with men who shared his values. Loyalty over greed, silence over arrogance, patience over impulse. By then, the Gambino family was the largest and most powerful of the 5 families, but also the most divided. The Gotti era had turned the organization into a spectacle. Cameras followed suits and smiles. Headlines spoke the words mafia and celebrity in the same breath. To the old Sicilian faction, men like Domenico, it was sacrilege. The Cosa Nostra was never meant to be seen. Its strength came from invisibility, from the fear of what couldn't be proven. Domenico despised the attention, the noise, the vanity. To him, power was not meant to be displayed. It was meant to be felt. In those years, he operated under Connie's guidance, overseeing rackets that stretched from construction sites to trucking contracts, from union control to international shipping. Money flowed like quiet rivers through the hands of men who never touched a gun, but controlled entire industries with a phone call. Domenico handled it with the same precision he had learned in Sicily. Every envelope, every deal, every handshake was cataloged in his mind, not on paper. His crew learned quickly. Mistakes were tolerated once, never twice. And above all, they learned that talking too much was more dangerous than stealing too much. When disputes arose, as they always did, Domenico had a gift for resolving them without blood. He could read men like open books, see fear before it showed in their eyes. His presence was enough to defuse situations that would have ended in gunfire under other captains. There was something unnerving about him, a calmness that suggested violence wasn't off the table, merely unnecessary. He didn't need to threaten. He simply made people imagine what he might do if they disappointed him. Imagination was a far better weapon than any pistol. He rose slowly, deliberately. While others scrambled for recognition, Domenico remained still. In the Mafia, stillness was power. It made others nervous, forced them to fill the silence with their own doubts. By the early 90s, he was managing operations that crossed borough lines, linked directly to the family's upper hierarchy. The gaudy circus was beginning to crumble under the weight of indictments and informants, and the old Sicilian faction saw an opening. They wanted the family to return to its roots: quiet money, quiet control, no headlines. And Domenico, the quiet Sicilian with eyes like stone, was the perfect embodiment of that vision. But as his power grew, so did the attention from law enforcement. The FBI had learned from their mistakes. They no longer chased the loud ones. They watched the silent ones. They started listening to the whispers, the transactions that didn't make noise. Domenico appeared in files, mentioned in intercepted conversations, always indirectly. He was the quiet guy, the Italian, Dom from 18th Avenue. Never enough to charge him, but enough to know he was pulling strings behind the curtain. For all their surveillance, they never caught him saying anything incriminating. Wiretaps captured his voice maybe twice, and both times it was mundane, small talk about work, the weather, life. Nothing the law could use. It was as if he didn't exist in the criminal sense, yet his shadow loomed over every deal in the Gambino sphere. That invisibility frustrated the agents and fascinated his peers. In a world full of loud predators, Domenico had become a ghost, everywhere and nowhere at once. In private, he lived modestly. No mansions, no fleets of cars, no gold chains. His home was simple, his routines predictable. He went to church on Sundays, visited family, drank espresso at the same cafe every morning. To outsiders, he looked like a disciplined old immigrant, maybe a small-time businessman. But those who understood knew the truth. Every smile from a shopkeeper, every handshake in that neighborhood carried a weight of unspoken allegiance. One of the younger associates once asked him why he didn't live like the others, why he didn't show off the success he'd earned. Domenico looked at him and said, "A man who needs to prove he has power and never really had it." That line became a quiet proverb in the circles that followed him. It defined his entire philosophy. Control was not about being seen. It was about being remembered. During this time, he began to take on more responsibility. Connie, aging and cautious, started trusting Domenico with decisions that once required approval from above. Business disputes, internal tensions, delicate negotiations. Domenico handled them all with that same unnerving calm. He didn't just enforce the rules, he embodied them. And when he spoke, people listened, not because they feared him, but because they knew he had thought through every word. Inside the family, a transformation was happening. The flamboyant era of the goddess was dying. The FBI had crippled much of the old network. The new generation of mobsters lacked discipline, chasing fast money through reckless ventures. But the Sicilian faction, quiet, strategic, patient, began reclaiming influence. Domenico was at the center of that resurgence. To many, he represented a return to legitimacy, to structure, to the code that had once made the Mafia untouchable. Around this time, whispers began circulating about his potential future. Some called him the next natural leader, others dismissed it as fantasy. But every passing year made the whispers louder. The family needed stability, and Domenico's very existence radiated it. He was a man who could make chaos vanish without raising his voice, a man whose silence inspired more obedience than threats ever could. In private moments, he remained introspective. He knew what power meant. Not glamour, not glory, but burden. Every decision carried consequences that rippled outward. Men lived or died by words he didn't even have to speak. He carried that weight without flinching, though sometimes late at night, when the streets were quiet and the city hummed softly through the walls, he thought of Sicily. The island had taught him everything about survival, patience, loyalty, fear, but America had taught him about control. The two halves of his life had fused into something formidable, a Sicilian soul operating with American precision. His name spread beyond New York. Old contacts from Palermo and Naples sent messages through intermediaries, acknowledging him, offering quiet partnerships, smuggling routes, trade deals, old debts repaid and loyalty. The Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra itself, saw in him a reflection of their own values, a man who had carried the code across the ocean and kept it alive in a city that had forgotten how to be quiet. That transatlantic bond deepened, unseen but powerful. He became a link between worlds, the old and the new, the island and the empire. Law enforcement noticed, of course. They began whispering about a Sicilian revival in the Gambino family. Agents speculated that the Americans had lost control to their old country counterparts. They weren't entirely wrong. The Zips, once seen as mysterious outsiders, were now holding the reins again. And Domenico was their quiet figurehead, not shouting orders, but setting an example that others followed instinctively. By the mid-90s, his position within the family was unquestioned. He was no longer just a loyal soldier or a competent captain. He was an architect, shaping the family's future, brick by brick, without drawing attention. He avoided the flashpoints of violence that defined other families' collapses. Where others saw confrontation, he saw opportunity. Where others reacted, he waited. He believed that patience was the purest form of power, and by now, everyone around him did too. But in that life, power always attracts danger. His quiet influence began making certain men uneasy, both within and outside the Gambino family. The idea of a Sicilian-dominated hierarchy didn't sit well with everyone. Some feared it meant losing their piece of the American pie. Others simply resented his rise. Rumors spread that he was too calculating, too cold, too detached. But those whispers never reached his ears directly. No one dared confront him, because beneath his calm exterior was an unspoken truth. Those who stood in his way tended not to last long. And yet, Domenico wasn't reckless. He didn't retaliate against jealousy or paranoia. He understood that fear was a more useful tool when it remained abstract. Let them wonder. Let them guess. It was safer that way. In the underworld, mystery was better than muscle. He maintained his composure, even when the FBI came knocking again. This time not with charges, but with questions. They wanted cooperation. They wanted names. Domenico smiled politely, as if they were old friends discussing the weather, and said nothing. The agents left frustrated, the same way they always did. Later, one of them wrote in a report, "He doesn't need to talk to be intimidating. He makes silence feel like a threat." That line would follow him through his career, the man who ruled with silence. The years rolled forward, and Domenico's legend grew. He had become something of a ghost story within organized crime circles, a man whose influence could be felt but rarely seen. When the younger members of the family asked about him, older ones would simply say, "He's the kind of man you hope never has to call you." That was all they needed to know. By the late 90s, he had everything he'd ever wanted: control, respect, and invisibility. But even he knew that power in the mafia was never permanent. It was borrowed, not owned. The next storm was always brewing, the next betrayal already being whispered somewhere in the dark. Domenico prepared for it quietly, the way he always did, by staying still while everyone else moved. And when that storm came, when the family once again found itself fractured, hunted, and leaderless, Domenico Cefalù would be ready. The Sicilian boy who had once watched powerful men from afar was now becoming one himself. Not the loud kind, not the ones who burned bright and died fast, but the kind who endured, the kind who rebuilt, the kind whose silence would echo longer than any gunshot. In a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was tradition, Domenico Cefalù was writing a different story, one written not in blood, but in restraint. His rise wasn't explosive, it was inevitable. The family needed a man who could lead without showing his hand, who could restore the old balance between fear and respect. And he was already becoming that man. Soon, he would no longer be the quiet one behind the curtain. He would be the one pulling it closed. And when the next chapter of the Gambino story began, it would not be written in the language of the loud or the reckless, but in the quiet, deliberate tone of a man from Palermo who had learned that true power never has to shout. Chapter 5. Omerta and Court Contempt Charges. The courtroom was cold, too bright, too public. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the air carried the same sharp tension as a firing range. Rows of lawyers, reporters, and agents sat waiting for something, anything, that might finally crack the man who had spent years building a reputation on silence. Domenico Cefalù sat at the defense table, his suit pressed, his hands folded neatly before him. His eyes moved occasionally toward the prosecutor, but revealed nothing. To most, it looked like indifference. To those who knew him, it was control, the kind of control that could suffocate a room. They said he had been called in to testify about Pasquale Cani, his old associate, his mentor, the man who had brought him into the heart of the Gambino family. But in reality, the trial was about something far deeper. It was a test of loyalty, of the sacred code that defined their world, Omerta, the silence that separated the living from the dead. When the judge asked if he understood the questions, Domenico nodded once. When asked to speak, he said nothing. His lawyer shifted beside him, trying to look confident, but even he could feel the weight pressing down. Every agent in the room wanted this man to speak. They didn't need him to confess. They just needed him to break. A single word, a name, a phrase, it would have been enough to bring down everything built around the Sicilian faction. But Domenico had no intention of giving them what they wanted. The silence that had saved him for decades was not a weakness. It was his shield. The prosecutors tried every tactic. They reminded him of the years he had already served. They hinted at leniency, at deals, at a chance to walk free and leave the life behind. But they were talking to a man who had never believed in freedom the way they did. To Domenico, freedom wasn't walking the streets without chains. It was living without betrayal. His code was older than their laws, older than their threats. He wasn't playing their game. He was following a different set of rules entirely. He sat there for hours, silent, unmoved. Each time they asked him about Connie, about the family, about operations that everyone in the room knew existed but no one could prove, he simply looked at them, calm, patient, uninterested. It wasn't defiance in his expression. It was something colder. He was waiting them out, just as he had waited out so many others before. Time, he knew, was the true weapon of men like him. The judge's patience wore thin. The gavel cracked like thunder as warnings filled the air. "You are in contempt of court," the judge said finally, his voice echoing through the chamber. Domenico's response was a slight tilt of the head, a look that almost resembled a nod. Not an apology, just acknowledgement. Within moments, the decision was made. 18 months for civil contempt. Later, 33 more for criminal contempt. Together, nearly 4 years for saying nothing. Most men would have traded their soul to cut that sentence in half. Domenico didn't even blink. As the guards let him out, the prosecutor muttered under his breath, "He's a dead man walking." But the agents who'd been watching him for years knew better. He wasn't walking to his death. He was walking deeper in a legend. Back in prison, the air felt familiar. The same metallic echo of footsteps, the same hollow smell of disinfectant and sweat. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply resumed the rhythm that had once kept him sane. Wake early. Drink black coffee. Read. Watch. Wait. To outsiders, it looked like punishment. To him, it was routine. The world had changed since his last incarceration, but the core truth hadn't. In a life built on loyalty, silence was the only language that mattered. Inside those walls, news traveled in whispers. Men from other families, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, sent quiet messages of respect. Some even referred to him as the monk, not because he was religious, but because he lived like one, disconnected from noise, detached from desire, guided by an inner discipline that few could match. He never bragged, never cursed, never tried to justify his silence. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than any testimony could. The FBI tried again. They sent in intermediaries, people who had once known him. They offered better conditions, reduced sentences, protection programs. They couldn't understand how a man could sacrifice years of his life just to protect others, people who might not even return the favor. But they didn't understand men like Domenico. For him, loyalty wasn't a negotiation. It was a religion. Breaking omerta was worse than dying. You could lose your life and still be remembered. But break the code, and you lost your name. There's a strange thing that happens when a man embraces silence fully. The world starts to lose its power over him. Time moves differently. The walls no longer close in. They just fade into the background. Domenico had mastered that state. Other inmates watched him with quiet fascination. They saw a man who could sit still for hours without a flicker of impatience, whose face never betrayed boredom or fear. When tempers flared, he walked away. When fights broke out, he didn't turn his head. He had transcended the chaos of prison life. It was as if his mind existed somewhere else, somewhere untouchable. Outside, the family was changing again. The gaudy era was fading, the flashy suits replaced by cautious whispers. The Sicilian faction, once a minority, now ascendant, saw in Domenico's silence a symbol of something they wanted to restore. He had proven that the old code still meant something. While others had flipped, ratted, and traded honor for comfort, he had stood still and said nothing. His loyalty didn't just protect men, it protected an entire legacy. When his sentence ended, the guards released him with the same quiet respect they'd shown before. One of them shook his head and said, "You could have walked out years ago, you know." Domenico smiled faintly, almost kindly. "Then I'd have had to look over my shoulder every day," he said. "This way I can walk straight." It was the most he'd spoken in years. Outside, Brooklyn felt colder than he remembered. The streets were busier, louder, filled with faces that didn't know his name and never would. But within the small circles that mattered, word of his release spread like smoke. "Italian Dom's out," they said. And with those words came a sense of gravity, of old ghosts returning. Men who had once doubted his resolve now looked at him as something almost sacred. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a keeper of the code, the living embodiment of omerta. He returned to work quietly, as always. No celebration, no fanfare. Just a man stepping back into a world that had missed him more than it realized. The family was fractured, uncertain. The old hierarchy had shifted. New faces had risen and fallen in his absence. But Domenico wasn't concerned. He understood that power, like loyalty, was cyclical. The loud ones burned fast. The quiet ones endured. In private meetings, men listened to him more carefully than before. His time in prison had given him something that no title could: credibility. He had proven his loyalty not through words, but through sacrifice. In the Mafia, that kind of loyalty was currency rarer than gold. When he spoke, it was never about vengeance or glory. It was about order, about returning to the discipline that once made their family untouchable. He told them that respect could rebuild what greed had destroyed. He began advising quietly again, offering calm words where tempers flared. Younger members looked at him with awe. To them, he was like a relic from a purer age, one who had lived through storms and still stood unmoved. He taught them patience, the art of waiting for the right opportunity, of letting others destroy themselves with their own noise. He told them, power isn't about shouting. It's about who stays standing when everyone else stops talking. Law enforcement continued to monitor him, hoping that sooner or later, the quiet man would slip. But Domenico had learned too much. He operated like smoke, visible for a moment, then gone. He used no phones, avoided meetings in public, never repeated a name out loud. If he needed to communicate, he did it through trusted intermediaries, men who owed him their freedom and their lives. They called him Invisible Dom, and the name stuck. The contempt charges that were meant to break him had instead forged his legend. Within the hierarchy of organized crime, his silence had become a weapon. It commanded more fear than violence ever could. Even among rivals, there was respect. They might not have liked him, but they trusted his word, or his lack of it. If Domenico promised to stay silent, he meant it. And that kind of reliability, in a world built on betrayal, was priceless. Years later, one federal agent described him in an interview. He's like a ghost with a heartbeat. You can't catch him because he doesn't leave traces. He doesn't talk, doesn't brag, doesn't even threaten. He just waits. And then, somehow he wins. That was the reputation he carried. Patient, calculated, inevitable. Even the older dons, men who had once looked down on the Zips as outsiders, now treated him as an equal. His silence had elevated him beyond nationality, beyond faction. He was, in their eyes, the purest expression of Cosa Nostra's spirit. Quiet, loyal, unshakable. When he entered a room, conversation softened. When he spoke, men listened as though the words were carved in stone. The world outside the Mafia, however, was changing faster than anyone inside could keep up with. The FBI had new tools, new laws, new ways to break the code that had once been unbreakable. But Domenico's existence proved that not everyone could be reached. He was the exception to the modern rule of betrayal, the last of a dying breed, men who would rather rot in silence than live with dishonor. And yet, even he wasn't immune to the slow erosion of trust that came with age and power. He knew that silence could protect him only so long. Sooner or later, new threats would rise. Ambitious men who mistook quiet for weakness, lawmen who mistook patience for retreat. But he also knew something they didn't. Silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was strategy. Every moment he refused to speak was a moment he forced others to reveal themselves. In his later years, he began to reflect on what Omerta had cost him. The years lost behind bars. The distance it created between him and the world beyond his circle. He never married, never had children. His loyalty belonged to an idea, not a person. Some nights, alone in his kitchen, he would pour a small glass of wine and stare out at the quiet street. He wasn't haunted exactly, just aware. He knew that the same code that had protected him had also confined him. Silence, after all, doesn't only keep secrets, it buries them. Still, when he thought of breaking it, even for a moment, he felt the old instinct rise again, the one that told him the world outside could never understand. To speak was to destroy everything he had built, everything he stood for. His silence had defined him, protected him, and, in many ways, redeemed him. It had made him more than just another name in a courtroom. It had made him a symbol. And so, as the years moved forward, Domenico Cefalù remained what he had always been. Steady, composed, untouchable. The man who never broke. The man who never spoke. His contempt sentences had not been punishments. They had been tests. And he had passed them with the same quiet discipline that had carried him from the backstreets of Palermo to the power corridors of New York's underworld. But history has a strange way of circling back. The same silence that protected him for so long would one day draw new eyes. Younger prosecutors, hungrier agents, rivals with ambitions too loud to ignore. The world was changing again, and even the quietest men could not hide forever. Somewhere in the shadows, the next challenge was already forming. And when it came, Domenico would face it the only way he knew how, without a word. Chapter 6. The Gambino family under pressure. The storm didn't come all at once. It came quietly, like the slow tightening of a noose. In the early 1990s, New York's underworld was a wounded animal, still breathing, still dangerous, but bleeding from every direction. The Gotti era had burned too hot for too long. Cameras had turned the Mafia into theater, and the streets that once whispered its name now shouted it into microphones. For the first time in decades, The walls around Cosa Nostra were beginning to crack. Men who once swore eternal loyalty were trading secrets for deals, and the old hierarchy, the invisible empire that had ruled New York's unions, ports, and neighborhoods, was collapsing under its own weight. But while the loud ones were dragged into headlines and prison cells, one man stayed invisible, untouched by the chaos. Domenico Cefalù watched from the edges, patient, calculating, silent as ever. He knew what the others didn't. The louder the fire burned, the quicker it consumed itself. The Gambino family had been the crown jewel of the American Mafia. Its reach extended through every layer of the city: construction, shipping, garbage, labor, even fashion. Under Paul Castellano, it had operated like a corporation. Under John Gotti, it had become a spectacle. By the time Gotti was arrested in 1990, the damage was already done. The FBI had infiltrated their meetings, recorded their conversations, turned their enforcers. Every flashing camera, every magazine headline, had left fingerprints. What once thrived in shadows was now dragged into light, and light, in the Mafia, was death. Inside the ranks, fear and suspicion spread like poison. Soldiers wondered who was wired. Captains doubted each other. Entire crews vanished overnight, some arrested, some silenced. Domenico stayed still. He had no need for glory, no desire to stand in front of cameras or courts. His power came from being unseen, from being the man no one could quote, because no one could recall hearing him say a single incriminating thing. His restraint had always set him apart, but now it became his greatest weapon. In a family tearing itself apart, he was the rare man who understood that survival meant subtraction, cutting out the noise until only control remained. The FBI called it the age of cooperation. What it really was the death of the old code. Omerta, once sacred, was being sold off piece by piece. Men who had stood in smoke-filled back rooms, swearing blood, oaths now sat in sterile conference rooms, sipping coffee with agents, trading loyalty for leniency. It was a betrayal that would have been unthinkable in Domenico's youth. In Palermo, men had died with their secrets. In New York, they gave them away for protection. Every new defector tore another hole in the fabric of that secret society. But while others ranted about treachery, Domenico adjusted. He didn't waste energy on outrage. He saw the new reality for what it was. The world was changing, and those who couldn't adapt would be buried by it. He began pulling the remaining Sicilian faction tighter together. The Zips, as they were known, had always been a small but disciplined presence within the Gambinos. They were colder, quieter, more methodical. They didn't trust outsiders, especially not the American-born gangsters who chased fame. For years, they had been looked down upon, considered too cautious, too foreign. But in this new era of surveillance and betrayal, their very nature became an advantage. They didn't talk. They didn't brag. They didn't even use phones. They operated like ghosts, using the same careful habits that had been born generations earlier on the hills of Sicily. Domenico was their anchor. He kept business alive through small, unremarkable routines. Meetings over espresso in cafes too noisy for recording devices. Conversations disguised as gossip about soccer or politics. Deals arranged through intermediaries who didn't even know who they were representing. He didn't rebuild the family. He restructured silence. Every move he made was designed not to grow the empire, but to protect it from implosion. The Americans were obsessed with expansion. Domenico was obsessed with endurance. He knew that the only way to survive a storm was not to fight it head-on, but to bend with it. The mid-90s were brutal. The commission trials had gutted the 5 families. The Lucchese's and Colombos were bleeding. The Bananos were barely hanging on, and the Gambinos were trapped between fading glory and federal assault. Every week brought new indictments, new informants, new betrayals. The once unbreakable underworld was turning itself inside out. But through the chaos, Domenico's name stayed off paper. He wasn't flashy enough to headline an indictment. He wasn't reckless enough to be caught on tape. The FBI's files on him were thick with speculation and thin with evidence. They called him uncooperative, insulated, low visibility. In truth, they had no idea what he was really doing, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His mentor, Pasquale Cani, was eventually brought down by the same system he had taught Domenico to navigate. The indictment was heavy, the evidence thick. When Cani was convicted, the FBI thought it was only a matter of time before Domenico followed. But the opposite happened. Cani's downfall left a vacuum, and vacuums in the mafia don't stay empty for long. Domenico stepped into the gap naturally, not by seizing it, but by allowing others to realize he was the only one who could fill it. His calm made men trust him. His history made them respect him. His silence made them fear him. By the late 90s, the Gambino family had split into factions. The American-born members were loud, impulsive, reckless. They chased money through scams that drew attention, credit card fraud, fake businesses, drug deals that spilled into violence. The Sicilians, under Domenico's quiet guidance, played the long game. They focused on the industries that built slow, clean money, construction, trucking, waste management, shipping. Legal fronts that made tracing criminal activity nearly impossible. When the government cracked down on one, they simply moved to another, like chess pieces shifting before the opponent realized the board had changed. He knew that real power didn't lie in the money itself, but in the flow of it. If you could control how money moved, where it was hidden, how it was cleaned, who touched it, you didn't need to control every man. You only needed to control the system. And Domenico controlled it so quietly that most didn't even notice until years later. His composure became legend within the family. Men would come to him frantic, panicked about investigations, betrayals, debts. Domenico would listen without interruption, then give them an answer in a single sentence. No lectures, no theatrics, just precision. His calm was contagious. It reminded them of what the mafia had once been: structured, patient, disciplined. To the older generation, he was a reminder of their roots. To the younger, he was something mythical, a ghost from a time before their world became loud and desperate. The FBI kept watching. Surveillance teams parked near his home, followed his car, recorded his associates. But they never caught him doing anything criminal. He didn't meet in the usual places. He didn't use the usual people. He was cautious to the point of paranoia. But it wasn't fear that guided him. It was instinct. He had lived too long in a world where trust was a luxury. In his silence, he had built armor thicker than concrete. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, Domenico wasn't detached from the family's pain. He saw the damage the government had done, but more than that, he saw the damage the mafia had done to itself. The betrayals, the greed, the erosion of the old code. It had turned Cosa Nostra from a brotherhood into a business of survival. He knew the romantic image of the mafia was gone forever, but he also knew that its essence, the discipline, the loyalty, the structure, could still be preserved, if only by a few. That became his mission. He wasn't trying to rule the family. He was trying to preserve its soul. He began mentoring quietly, passing down the old Sicilian teachings to younger men who still cared about the code. He didn't preach or threaten. He simply showed them through example. Patience, discretion, control. When one young associate once asked him how he'd managed to stay alive and free for so long, Domenico replied, "Because I never let anyone see me angry." That was his secret. Not fearlessness, but control. In a world driven by impulse, he was a master of stillness. By the turn of the millennium, the mafia was no longer what it once was. Its grip on the city had weakened. Its influence in politics and labor was being replaced by corporations and bureaucracy. The FBI had learned to think like mobsters, to infiltrate their systems, to anticipate their moves. But in that modern chaos, men like Cefalu still thrived. The old rules that once made him seem outdated were now the only ones that still worked. The flashier criminals were gone, either buried, imprisoned, or broken. The survivors were the quiet ones, the planners, the ones who understood that invisibility was the last form of power left. The family structure began to stabilize again, though in a quieter form. The Sicilian faction, once pushed aside by the American showman, had reclaimed control. Domenico was no longer just an advisor. He was the moral center. Even without a title, his word carried the weight of command. When disputes arose, men sought his judgment. When alliances shifted, they waited for his approval. He never demanded obedience, but he always received it. Law enforcement began to notice that the Gambinos were changing. The violence had slowed, the chaos subsided. It looked to them like decline, but it was really evolution. The family had learned to adapt, to blend back into the city's bloodstream. And behind that transformation was a man who understood that survival wasn't about dominance. It was about patience. Domenico had turned the family from a wounded beast into something else entirely, a shadow that moved without making a sound. In private, though, he felt the weight of the years, the endless pressure, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that one mistake, one careless word, one wrong meeting, could unravel everything. He was not immune to exhaustion, but he carried it the way he carried everything else, quietly, without complaint. Some nights, he would sit by his window, the city lights reflecting off the glass, and think about the cost of what he had chosen. In Sicily, silence had been survival. In America, it had become his prison. Still, he wouldn't have changed a thing. To him, this was the only life that made sense, the only life that matched the rhythm of his blood. The Gambino family was no longer feared the way it once was, but it was respected again, and that mattered more. The chaos of the past decade had shown that noise only led to ruin. Domenico's method, quiet, methodical, invisible, wasn't glamorous, but it worked. He had turned patience into power, silence into currency. And though few outside the family knew his name, inside it, everyone did. He was the calm at the center of storm. But storms never truly end. They just shift direction. As the new millennium unfolded, the government found new ways to hunt them. Wiretaps and phones disguised as friends, satellites that tracked cars, undercover agents that looked like brothers. Domenico knew it was only a matter of time before the next wave came. But he wasn't afraid. He'd survived too much to start fearing the inevitable now. And when it did come, when the next round of indictments hit, when the headlines screamed of another final blow to organized crime, he would do what he had always done. He would wait. He would listen. He would stay silent. Because in a world that kept getting louder, Domenico Cefalù had learned the one truth that would always keep him alive. The man who says the least lasts the longest. Chapter 7. Underboss and Sicilian Ascendancy. It began quietly, the way most of Domenico Cefalu's chapters did. No announcement, no ceremony, just a subtle shift in how men spoke his name. Somewhere between whispered conversations and cautious nods, the title changed. He was no longer just the quiet consigliere, no longer just the calm Sicilian in the background. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, the second in command to the empire that once ruled New York from its shadows. The rise didn't come through bloodshed or betrayal. It came the way he had always moved, slowly, deliberately, invisibly. One day, he was a trusted advisor. The next, he was the foundation beneath the boss himself. And in that silent ascension, something larger began to unfold. The return of the Sicilians to power, the rebirth of the old code that America had almost forgotten. The years leading up to his appointment had been brutal for the family. The gaudy years had left deep scars: federal trials, informants, wiretaps, endless surveillance. The very name, Gambino, had become a curse in law enforcement circles, a symbol of both arrogance and decline. But in the ashes of that chaos, a new order was forming. The loud ones had fallen. The reckless ones were gone. The family needed discipline again, needed someone who could rebuild it brick by brick without attracting the cameras or the heat. And behind closed doors, everyone agreed on one thing. Domenico was the only man capable of it. He didn't seek the role. He never had. But in a world where power usually came to those who demanded it, his reluctance made him even more dangerous. People trusted him precisely because he didn't crave the throne. They knew he wouldn't burn down the empire to sit on top of it. He wasn't a dreamer. He was a custodian, a man who understood that the Mafia's survival depended not on expansion, but on preservation. When the call came, he accepted with the same quiet nod that had defined his entire life. No champagne, no celebration, just acknowledgement. Duty had found him again. As underboss, his reach extended deeper than ever. He controlled the daily flow of the family's operations: money, manpower, strategy. Every major decision passed through him, even if his name never appeared in the paperwork. He didn't issue orders like a general. He guided, nudged, and corrected. When others argued, he listened. When others panicked, he steadied them. To the younger members, he seemed almost prophetic, the kind of man who could see trouble before it happened. To the older ones, he was comfortingly familiar, a reminder of the old Sicilian way, when loyalty mattered more than greed and silence was sacred. His leadership was unlike anything the modern mafia had seen in decades. There were no grand gestures, no outbursts, no public displays of dominance. He moved like smoke through the city, present, but impossible to grasp. He met people in quiet restaurants, in bakeries, at the edge of construction sites where the noise of drills drowned every word. His system was simple: less exposure, less risk. Every meeting was need to know, every conversation planned. If someone didn't need to hear something, they never did. It was a return to the roots, a throwback to the kind of discipline that had once made the mafia untouchable. His greatest challenge came from within. The American-born faction, still hungry for fast money, didn't always understand his methods. They saw his restraint as old-fashioned, his patience as weakness. But Domenico never argued. He let results speak for him. Under his quiet leadership, the family's finances stabilized. The businesses that had been crumbling under federal scrutiny began to recover. Construction companies started winning contracts again, legitimate fronts flourished, and the Gambinos slowly regained their place in the city's undercurrent. He didn't rebuild through violence. He rebuilt through control. To law enforcement, it looked like the family was fading into irrelevance. The flashy arrests stopped. The wiretaps turned up nothing. The violence slowed to a whisper. The FBI assumed the mafia was dying. But Domenico knew better. He had simply buried it deeper, out of sight, beneath layers of legitimacy and silence. While the agents celebrated their success, the Sicilian faction consolidated its grip. They weren't dead. They were invisible. In those years, Domenico became something more than an underboss. He became a symbol. The Zips, once dismissed as outsiders, were now the spine of the organization. Their code of silence, their old-world discipline, their refusal to adapt to American arrogance, it all began to define the new Gambino identity. Domenico was the bridge between two worlds, the last echo of the old mafia and the architect of its modern rebirth. He didn't talk about legacy. He built it quietly, one favor, one handshake, one unrecorded promise at a time. His work stretched beyond New York. The Sicilian connection that had once smuggled heroin across oceans had transformed into something more refined, a network of shared interests and silent understandings between Cosa Nostra in Italy and its American cousin. Domenico became a key node in that network. He wasn't running drug routes or violent rackets anymore. He was managing relationships, alliances based on trust that crossed continents. He had the kind of credibility few men ever achieved. In Sicily, they called him Il Silenzioso, the Silent One. In New York, they simply called him Dom. Both names carried the same meaning: respect wrapped in fear. But even power held in silence attracts enemies. Not everyone in the family was comfortable with the Sicilian resurgence. The younger American-born capos wanted flashier money, quicker results. They were tired of the old ways, tired of traditions that didn't seem to fit the modern world. Domenico watched them with quiet disappointment. He saw in them what he had feared all along, the hunger for noise that had destroyed men like Gotti. He didn't try to lecture them. He simply let the world do it for him. When the FBI inevitably came knocking on their doors, when their phones were tapped, when their friends started disappearing into witness protection, Domenico didn't gloat. He just waited. And when the smoke cleared, he was still there, unbothered, untouched, the last man standing. By the early 2000s, his influence had grown beyond titles. He had become the man behind the curtain, the voice that didn't need to speak to be heard. If a crew wanted approval for a move, they sought him first. If disputes needed settling, his word was law. He didn't issue threats. He didn't need to. In a world that lived and died by respect, his silence carried more weight than a dozen guns. When people asked what it was like to work under him, one soldier answered, "It's like serving a ghost. You never see him angry, but you always know he's there." Still, Domenico was not immune to the fatigue of leadership. The higher he rose, the heavier the silence became. Every choice he made carried consequences that rippled through hundreds of lives. Men went to prison, families suffered, alliances crumbled, all based on decisions that sometimes came down to a single look or a single pause. He carried that burden quietly, but it was there. At night, alone in his modest home, he would sit with his espresso and think about the men who had come before him, the bosses who had ruled with fists and fire and ended up dead or forgotten. He was different. He didn't want to be remembered for power. He wanted to be remembered for control. And yet, the world outside their walls was shifting again. Technology was changing everything. The old rules of communication, never use phones, never leave paper trails, were becoming obsolete. The FBI had new tools, new ways to listen, new ways to see. Even whispers could be captured now. Even shadows could leave digital traces. Domenico adapted. He built layers of insulation between himself and the family's day-to-day operations. If law enforcement came looking, all they would find were legitimate businesses, import companies, construction contracts, bakery supply firms. The real power was buried under the surface, where it had always belonged. His strategy paid off. By the mid-2000s, the Gambinos were the most stable of the five families. While others imploded under wiretaps and RICO charges, Domenico's network continued to function. They weren't the richest, but they were the safest. And in that safety, power quietly grew. Federal agents couldn't pin him down. Associates couldn't predict his next move. Even other families began to emulate his methods, adopting the same low-profile approach that had made him untouchable. But the balance of power never stays still. The years of calm gave rise to ambition in others. There were whispers about who might one day replace the current boss, who might take over when the old guard stepped aside. Domenico didn't participate in the gossip. He didn't have to. The truth was already moving toward him. The family was shifting again, preparing for another era, and everyone knew who stood at the center of that change. He didn't chase it, but power, as always, found him. Those who sat with him during that period said he radiated a kind of quiet certainty. Not arrogance, but inevitability. He spoke about the family's future the way a craftsman talks about his tools. Practical, patient, precise. He told his closest allies that the era of headlines was over. The smart ones, he said, will make money so quietly the law will forget we exist. It wasn't advice, it was prophecy. The law hadn't forgotten, though. The FBI's organized crime division still kept his name in its files, circled and underlined, marked with words like strategic, influential, untouchable. They knew he was there, but they couldn't reach him. He had built too many layers, too many buffers. The agents joked that he was like smoke. You could see the signs of fire, but you could never find the source. One even called him the ghost of the Gambinos. It was meant as frustration, but it became an accidental compliment. Inside the family, the Sicilian faction continued to dominate. Their influence stretched through every borough, every racket that still mattered. They weren't as visible as before, but they didn't need to be. Their power came from their ability to remain unseen, to outlast. Domenico's leadership had transformed the Gambinos into something the FBI didn't recognize, a hybrid of old-world discipline and modern invisibility. And through it all, Domenico remained unchanged. Calm, polite, patient. The same man who had once stood on a Palermo dock watching the sea, dreaming of something greater. As the years turned toward 2005, whispers began again. Rumors that the quiet underboss from Sicily was next in line. The family needed a true leader, someone who could keep the FBI at bay and the young hotheads under control. Domenico never confirmed or denied the rumors. When asked directly, he smiled that faint, disarming smile and said, "I'm just a working man." Everyone knew what that meant. He was waiting for time, for order, for the right moment. Waiting the way only he knew how. But waiting in the mafia is never passive. It's survival dressed as patience. Every quiet moment was a calculation, every small gesture a message. Domenico had learned long ago that power didn't have to move fast. It just had to move steady. And while others plotted their own ascents through greed or betrayal, he simply continued doing what he had always done. He endured. When the moment finally came, when the whispers became truth and the family turned its eyes to him, Domenico didn't celebrate. He didn't even react. He just nodded once, the same way he had the day he was made. The Sicilian had risen again, not through blood, not through fear, but through silence. And somewhere deep in the bones of the old Gambino family, in the fading heartbeat of Cosa Nostra itself, the code of Sicily pulsed again. The age of the loud dons was over. The era of the quiet king had begun. Chapter 8. Operation Old Bridge and Indictment. The winter of 2008 hit New York like a weight. Cold, gray, and heavy with tension that didn't show on the surface but hummed underneath. The city had changed. Polished towers where once there were cracked sidewalks, clean streets hiding old dirt. But in the shadows, the same invisible gears still turned. And somewhere deep inside that machinery, Domenico Cefalù sat quietly, his mind working the way it always had, methodical, patient, unshaken. For years, he had been the calm architect behind the rebirth of the Gambino family, a man whose silence had become a fortress. But that year, the fortress would be tested. The operation that would drag his name back into headlines didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper, a quiet investigation that would stretch from New York to Palermo, from the ashes of the American Mafia to the heart of Sicily itself. They called it Operation Old Bridge. The name wasn't random. It symbolized the ancient connection between the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and its American counterpart, the invisible bridge built decades earlier through blood, loyalty, and exile. Law enforcement wanted to destroy that bridge once and for all. They wanted to prove that the Gambino family wasn't a fading legend, but an international network still pulsing beneath the modern city. And at the center of that web, in their eyes, was Domenico Cefalù, the quiet man from Palermo who had risen to become the unseen architect of its resurgence. The FBI had been watching him for years, frustrated by his caution. They couldn't get to him the way they got to others. No phone calls, no careless conversations, no witnesses. He lived a disciplined life that seemed deliberately designed to leave nothing behind. But the Bureau had learned new tricks. They stopped chasing him directly and started watching everyone around him. Drivers, friends, business contacts, even distant relatives in Sicily. Piece by piece, they built a puzzle they thought would finally reveal the whole picture. The first cracks appeared not in New York, but across the Atlantic. In Palermo, Italian investigators were conducting their own operation against local mafia families. They intercepted calls, monitored shipments, followed money. And in those conversations, coded, fragmented, half-whispered, one name kept resurfacing, Dom. To the Sicilians, he was the connection, the man who could move things between worlds without ever being seen doing it. They spoke of him with respect, even admiration. To the authorities, it was proof that the old ties between the two continents had never really broken. They were alive, just quieter now. Back in the United States, the FBI started connecting those dots. They found patterns in shipping routes, construction deals, waste management companies, industries that had always been the mafia's camouflage. None of it screamed criminality, but together it painted a picture of control. Domenico's fingerprints weren't on anything, but his influence was everywhere. He was the kind of man who didn't need to sign orders. People simply understood what he wanted and made it happen. When the indictments came down on February 7th, it was like a wave hitting both sides of the Atlantic at once. Over 60 people were arrested in coordinated raids stretching from Brooklyn to Palermo. The headlines read like something out of another era. Mafia takedown links New York and Sicily. Reporters talked about the revival of the old families, about a new generation of mobsters trying to restore the glory of the past. But beneath the sensationalism was something quieter, something more dangerous. The government had targeted not just individuals, but the structure itself, the very network that allowed men like Domenico to exist in the first place. When agents arrived at his home, he didn't resist. He opened the door, calm as always, and let them in. The young agent leading the arrest later said it felt strange, like taking down a man who had already accepted the outcome before it happened. Domenico didn't shout, didn't argue. He asked for his coat, buttoned it neatly, and followed them outside. No anger, no fear, just composure, the kind that unnerves even the people enforcing the law. It was the same stillness that had defined him since Palermo, the stillness of a man who knew the world moved too fast for panic to be useful. In court, the charges were laid out with dramatic precision: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy. The government claimed he was at the center of an operation controlling contracts in the trucking and construction industries, manipulating bids, extorting companies through fear that never had to be spoken aloud. To the prosecution, it was proof that the Gambino family was still a machine, efficient, profitable, and guided by Sicilian discipline. To Domenico, it was theater. He had seen it all before: the confident prosecutors, the headlines, the declarations of final victory over organized crime. He knew how it ended. The law would take a victory lap, the papers would scream, and then, eventually, things would quiet down. They always did. He didn't deny anything. He didn't confess either. He simply listened. Every time the prosecutors tried to paint him as a criminal mastermind, he sat motionless, as if watching a play he'd already seen. His lawyer argued that he was nothing more than a hard-working man, a small-time laborer caught up in sensationalism. The jury didn't believe it, but they also didn't see the monster the FBI had promised. He wasn't the swaggering mob boss from the movies. He was polite, articulate, calm, almost disappointingly normal. That was his greatest advantage. Behind the scenes, law enforcement celebrated the arrests as a major blow. But within the family, it didn't play that way. Domenico's calm through the chaos became another legend in itself. Younger soldiers whispered that the boss had known about the indictments before they even came. Others said he'd planned his surrender to minimize damage. Whether true or not, the myth made him stronger. In the Mafia, image was power, and the image of a man unbroken by the system was worth more than any fortune. He eventually took a plea deal. 2 years. To outsiders, that seemed light for a man accused of orchestrating a criminal empire. But those who understood the game saw the truth. The government had built a case full of smoke but little fire. They could tie him to people, but not to actions. They could surround him with evidence, but none of it pointed directly at him. Once again, Domenico had slipped through the cracks. Not untouched, but undefeated. Prison didn't bother him. It was quieter this time. Shorter, easier. A pause, not a punishment. He treated it like a retreat, another test of endurance. Guards said he was polite, always reading, always composed. Other inmates kept their distance. Some respected him, others feared him, but everyone recognized something unusual about his calm. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, the quiet confidence of a man who knew he would walk out and pick up right where he left off. He was released in November 2009. 2 years gone, and yet the world outside felt strangely familiar. The family had changed again, but the foundations he had built were still there. The Sicilian discipline he'd instilled had held firm. Business continued quietly, profit steady, no unnecessary violence. Even as new players emerged, even as the media obsessed over newer, flashier stories, the Gambinos remained the most stable of the five families. That was no accident. It was the legacy of Domenico's method. He didn't return with fanfare. No one expected him to. He simply resumed his life, the same neighborhood, the same coffee shop, the same quiet walks. But within the family, his return carried the weight of prophecy. To them, he was proof that patience still worked, that silence still had power. He had faced the law twice, gone to prison twice, and come back stronger both times. The streets had a way of romanticizing men like that. The younger soldiers began studying his every move, trying to mimic his calm, his mannerisms, his way of never overreacting. Some even started calling him Il Vecchio, the Old One, a nod to both his age and his wisdom. Operation Old Bridge was supposed to be the government's final blow, but it had only solidified his legend. They had tried to break the bridge between Sicily and New York. Instead, they'd reminded both sides of how strong it still was. The Italian newspapers covered it with fascination, writing about the quiet Sicilian who had risen through the American Mafia with patience and precision. In Palermo, men who remembered him from his youth spoke of him with pride, as if he had carried a piece of the island's soul across the ocean. Back in Brooklyn, Domenico began moving with even greater caution. The world was changing faster than ever. Phones, cameras, the internet, all new dangers. The old rules of invisibility were harder to follow, but he found ways to adapt. He never used a cell phone. If he had to meet someone, it was in public, where conversation could blend into the crowd. His communication style became almost monk-like, short, coded, delivered through intermediaries. He didn't trust technology, didn't trust the New World obsession with speed. For him, power was still measured in how long you could wait, not how quickly you could act. The FBI, frustrated but persistent, kept watching. They followed him to cafes, tracked his meetings, recorded his associates. But they found nothing. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he was already gone. It was as if he existed on a different timeline, one where every move was pre-calculated years in advance. Agents started calling him the Ghost in private reports. They meant it as shorthand, but it was accurate. He had become the embodiment of the Mafia's oldest survival skill, presence without trace. But Domenico wasn't immortal. He knew that. Time was catching up. The younger generation didn't understand the code the way he did. They were reckless, impatient, eager to make their own names. He tried to teach them, but most weren't listening. The world no longer rewarded silence. It rewarded spectacle. Yet even as the culture shifted, Domenico's influence held. When disputes arose, his word was still final. When money needed direction, his advice still carried weight. He was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol, the last reminder of what the Mafia had once been before ego turned it into theater. In the months following his release, whispers began again. The family needed direction. The current leadership was tired, fragmented, uncertain. The Sicilian wing wanted stability. And in quiet rooms, behind locked doors, the conversations turned toward one name: Domenico Cefalù. He didn't campaign for it, didn't lobby. But everyone knew the truth. The quiet man had always been leading. All that was left was to make it official. He said little when the topic came up. He knew what power really meant: responsibility, risk, sleepless nights. But he also knew that this was his purpose. Every decision he'd ever made, every silence he'd ever kept, had led to this moment. He wasn't chasing a title. He was answering a calling. By 2011, the whispers became fact. The family, exhausted by years of instability, turned to the one man who had never failed them. Domenico accepted, as always, with calm. The Sicilian boy from Palermo, the one who had crossed the ocean chasing something he couldn't yet name, had become the boss of the Gambino family. Not through fear, not through blood, but through silence. Operation Old Bridge had been meant to destroy him. Instead, it crowned him. And as the world outside moved faster, louder, and more reckless with every passing year, Domenico Cefalù reminded everyone that true power didn't live in headlines or wiretaps. It lived in patience, in precision, in the quiet certainty that the man who says nothing cannot be misquoted, cannot be trapped, cannot be broken. The bridge they try to burn was still standing, and on its shadowed edge stood Domenico, the quiet architect who had proven, once again, that silence, real silence, is stronger than any wall of noise the world can build. Chapter 9. The Transition to Leadership. The world didn't notice the moment it happened. There were no flashing cameras, no dramatic arrests, no bloody coups in dim backrooms. It happened the way Domenico Cefalù preferred everything to happen. Quietly, naturally, as if the tides themselves had decided it. One day, he was the underboss of the Gambino family, the calm shadow behind every decision. And then, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. The old guard stepped aside, weary and fragmented, and Domenico became what everyone had long suspected he was destined to be, the official boss of the most storied crime family in America. It was the summer of 2011, and for the first time in decades, the Gambinos were ruled by a Sicilian again. Not a showman, not a celebrity, but a man of silence, a man whose power had never needed to raise its voice. When word of his rise began to circulate, it wasn't shouted through the streets. It moved in whispers, barbershops, cafes, docksides, quiet corners where men spoke carefully and listened even more carefully. "Italian Dom's the boss now," they said, and though the words were spoken softly, the weight behind them was heavy. It marked a return to roots, a restoration of the family soul. For too long, the American faction had chased glamour and attention. They'd filled tabloids instead of ledgers, care more about headlines than hierarchy. Domenico was the antidote to all of it. His leadership wasn't about spectacle. It was about repair. He didn't hold a ceremony. He didn't make speeches. His first act as boss was to do nothing at all, to let the dust settle, to watch how men behaved when they thought no one was watching. It was a test, one as old as Cosa Nostra itself. Those who sought to impress him with loud promises were quietly sidelined. Those who stayed humble, steady, consistent, those were the men he kept close. It was the same lesson he had carried from Sicily to America. That true loyalty reveals itself in silence, not in declarations. His leadership began in the simplest way, by restoring discipline. Under his rule, meetings were smaller, conversations shorter, paper trails non-existent. He brought back the old rules that had once kept the family invisible. No media attention, no unnecessary violence, no business without permission. He didn't reinvent the wheel. He just made it turn the way it was supposed to. Within months, the chaos that had followed the post-Gotti years began to fade. Money flowed again, steadily, quietly, the way it once had under Castellano's rigid order, but without the arrogance that had doomed it. Domenico wasn't building an empire for himself. He was rebuilding a structure for the next generation, one that could survive in a world where the FBI saw everything, where loyalty had become a myth and betrayal a currency. To outsiders, he seemed unremarkable. He lived in a modest home, worked at a legitimate job in a bakery supply company, and rarely left his neighborhood. To law enforcement, it was infuriating. They had spent decades chasing bosses who couldn't resist attention, who left trails of flash and ego wherever they went. Domenico was the opposite. He moved like smoke, visible only when he chose to be. They could follow him from home to work to church and find nothing more criminal than a man living quietly. But the agents knew better. They knew that power like his didn't need to shout. It whispered. It delegated. It existed in absence. Inside the family, his word became law, not through threats, but through the sheer authority of his presence. When disputes arose, they were brought to him. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. He made men explain themselves until they realized their own mistakes. He never slammed fists on tables, never raised his voice. His silence, as always, did the talking. It was said that being called to meet him was more intimidating than standing in front of any judge, because a judge could only decide your fate once. Domenico decided it quietly, permanently, without anyone ever knowing you'd been weighed and dismissed. The younger soldiers, men born long after the golden era of the Mafia, looked at him like a ghost from another time. They couldn't understand how someone so calm, so understated, could command so much fear. But the older ones, the survivors, knew. They'd seen loud men die fast, and quiet ones last forever. Domenico wasn't chasing immortality. He was embodying it. Every move he made reminded them of what the Mafia had once been before greed turned it into theater. Under his leadership, the Gambino family began to feel less like a crumbling relic and more like a secret society again. Hidden, structured, alive. Law enforcement noticed the difference too. The violence dropped sharply. The Gambinos weren't fighting over scraps anymore. There were no drive-bys, no flashy hits, no public displays of dominance. The family had gone dark. It was like watching a storm retreat into the sea, still dangerous but out of sight. FBI analysts wrote reports describing the Sicilian resurgence, the quiet professionalism that had replaced chaos. They noted Domenico's leadership style as low visibility, high efficiency. They couldn't prove anything, but they could feel his control in the patterns, the sudden discipline, the order where there had been disorder. But Domenico wasn't just restoring the family. He was reshaping it for a new age. The world of 2011 wasn't the world he had entered decades earlier. Technology had changed everything. Phones, emails, surveillance. The old ways of communication were obsolete. So he adapted. Meetings were coded through mundane errands. Messages passed through legitimate businesses. The family structure became harder to trace. Its hierarchy blurred intentionally. If law enforcement tried to map it, they'd find only names attached to clean operations, not the web beneath them. He had turned invisibility into an art form. Still, his leadership wasn't about paranoia. It was about balance. He didn't live in fear of the law. He simply refused to give it anything to work with. To his men, he preached restraint. You don't kill to prove strength, he told one capo. You kill when silence no longer protects you. It was an old lesson, one learned in Sicily's narrow streets and carried across the Atlantic. Violence was the last language, not the first. And under him, it became a rare dialect again. The Gambino family flourished quietly. Legitimate businesses thrived under their control. Construction companies, waste management, shipping, restaurant supply. These weren't just fronts, they were ecosystems. Each one fed the other. Each one insulated the rest. Money came in steady streams instead of explosive floods. And that was exactly how Domenico wanted it. He didn't believe in fast riches. Fast meant attention, and attention meant death. The goal wasn't wealth, it was longevity. And yet, the silence that kept him powerful also kept him isolated. Leadership, especially his kind of leadership, was a lonely thing. He couldn't afford friendships that weren't transactional. Every smile, every handshake, every glass of wine shared with an associate came with calculation. He had learned long ago that trust was both currency and poison. He gave just enough to keep men loyal, but never enough for them to see the whole of him. To rule through silence, you had to be a little bit invisible, even to those who followed you. Despite his distance, his men respected him with almost religious devotion. They called him the Quiet Don, sometimes even the monk. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't surround himself with mistresses or hangers-on. To them, that made him untouchable, an almost spiritual figure in a world that had long-forgotten discipline. There was a story that one of his soldiers once tried to tell a joke in his presence and caught himself mid-laugh, realizing how inappropriate it felt to disturb the silence. Domenico noticed, smiled faintly, and said, "Laughter is fine, as long as you remember what it costs." That small phrase spread through the ranks like scripture. But the peace he built was fragile, as peace always is in that world. The FBI wasn't the only threat. Ambition never dies quietly, and there were still men who dreamed of the old glory days. Men who wanted the fame, the money, the fast rise. They saw Domenico's restraint as weakness, mistaking quiet for inaction. He didn't confront them. He let them burn themselves out. When they overreached, when their greed drew attention, It was always the same: indictments, betrayals, collapse. And when the dust settled, Domenico was still there, untouched, watching from the same calm distance. By 2012, law enforcement was calling his leadership the beginning of a new era of old-school mafia. They couldn't decide whether it was a regression or an evolution. Some believed the Sicilians were dragging organized crime back into the past. Others saw something more sophisticated, an adaptation to a world where the only way to survive was to disappear completely. Both were right. Domenico wasn't nostalgic for the old days. He was repurposing them. The same code that once ruled rural Sicily now thrived in the digital age, updated through patience and precision. As the years passed, his name faded from the public eye again. The FBI had other targets, other families, louder criminals. But inside that quiet corner of New York, Domenico's empire expanded in silence. His men prospered. The Gambinos became known not for violence or scandal, but for consistency. To them, he wasn't just a boss. He was the equilibrium that had been missing for decades. Even among his enemies, there was respect. Rival families, some decimated by informants and infighting, viewed Domenico as a model of endurance. He doesn't chase headlines. One old Genovese capo reportedly said, he outlasts them. That was the essence of his power, not dominance, but duration. In a world where everyone wanted to win fast, he played for eternity. But leadership in the mafia, no matter how careful, always carries risk. The same invisibility that protected him also made succession complicated. No one knew who would follow him, who could carry that same stillness. He wasn't grooming a loud successor. He was searching for someone who understood quiet power. And as the years passed, it became clear that few men did. The new generation, raised in a digital world, lacked the patience, the discipline, the reverence for silence. They lived fast. They talked too much. They didn't understand that the moment you explained power, you lost it. Domenico understood that better than anyone. He began to slow down, but not in the way most men did. His mind stayed sharp, his presence commanding. He simply withdrew further into the shadows, letting others handle the noise. It was the final evolution of his leadership, the transition from active control to invisible influence. He no longer needed to be seen or even mentioned. The structure he'd built would run itself. His name was now an idea, a warning, a myth. Don't forget, his men would whisper, the quiet man is still watching. The FBI, still tracking him, realized the same truth too late. One analyst described it in a report. Cefalu represents the future of organized crime, not in violence or expansion, but in survival through invisibility. The Gambinos haven't disappeared. They've learned how to live in plain sight. It was both a compliment and a confession. They had spent decades trying to kill the mafia by making it visible. Domenico had undone all of that with one simple strategy: stay quiet, stay small, stay standing. When asked once by a trusted friend if he ever regretted the life, the prisons, the trials, the endless vigilance, he paused for a long time before answering. No, he said finally. This is the only way I ever learned how to breathe. It wasn't pride. It was truth. For him, the mafia wasn't an empire. It was oxygen, an unbroken rhythm that pulsed through his veins, the same rhythm that began in Sicily and carried him through decades of storms. By the time the world finally realized who Domenico Cefalù truly was, it was already too late. He had rewritten the role of a mafia boss without ever speaking a single line. No speeches, no blood-soaked drama, just stillness and endurance. And as the city continued to chase its own noise, somewhere in Brooklyn, behind closed doors and quiet streets, the old Sicilian code still breathed, reborn in the calm shadow of a man who had never needed to shout to rule. That was Domenico Cefalu's reign. Not a rise, not a fall, but a continuation. The Sicilian who crossed an ocean, the soldier who became the silent king, had completed the circle. And though the headlines would never capture it, those who understood, the men who lived in that silence, knew exactly what he had done. He hadn't just led the Gambino family. He had outlived it. Chapter 10. The Quiet Don's Empire. Power, in its purest form, doesn't roar. It hums quietly in the background, invisible yet undeniable. By the mid-2010s, that hum carried one name throughout the underworld: Domenico Cefalù. To the untrained eye, he was just another aging Sicilian immigrant in Brooklyn. To the men who moved money and loyalty through the city's veins, he was something else entirely: the Quiet Don, the last architect of a world that refused to die. Under his leadership, the Gambino family wasn't a relic. It was a shadow economy, patient and unseen, thriving beneath the noise of a city that had long since forgotten how to notice silence. Domenico didn't lead through fear or spectacle. He led through structure, an empire so tightly wound in loyalty and discretion that even those inside it could never see the whole picture. The transition from underboss to boss had been almost seamless, but the transformation of the family itself, that was Domenico's masterpiece. The Gambino organization under his reign was not the flashy, headline-hungry machine of the Gotti era. It was quiet, clinical, surgical. Violence was no longer a strategy. It was a failure. Every move was calculated. Every relationship designed to blur legality and crime until the two were indistinguishable. The family operated through legitimate companies, blending the underworld into the real one so smoothly that even the law began to lose its sense of where one ended and the other began. He had turned the mafia from a gangster's dream into an institution of silence. Domenico's empire didn't glitter. It breathed. The money flowed in rivers so clean they looked like springs: contracts, loans, investments, real estate, union influence, imports, exports. The operations weren't glamorous, but they were endless. The docks, once ruled by shouting foremen and cash under the table, now ran on invisible hands. Trucking companies under shell corporations, waste disposal firms with spotless ledgers, restaurants and bakeries owned through cousins of cousins. Nothing was ever in his name, yet everything was under his control. The key was distance. He never touched the money directly. He simply made sure it found its way to the right places. His leadership style had become legend, even inside the family. Men spoke of meetings that felt more like confessions. Domenico would sit, calm and silent, as a capo explained a problem or a failure. When he finally spoke, it was never in anger. He didn't need to threaten. A single sentence from him could shift a man's loyalty, freeze his blood, or save his life. He had mastered the art of pressure without noise, a skill learned in the tight-lipped streets of Palermo where every word was a risk. In his world, words weren't power. Silence was. The younger generation of the family struggled to understand him. They had grown up in a digital world where attention was currency, where everything needed to be seen to be real. Domenico came from a different universe entirely, one where being unseen was the only proof of existence. They couldn't comprehend how a man could hold such absolute control without ever needing to raise his voice or post a message, without photographs, without evidence. They thought power was performance. He taught them that power was patience, and those who couldn't learn quietly disappeared from relevance. Law enforcement kept trying to paint him as a relic, a fading ghost clinging to the past. But their reports betrayed their confusion. Every new analysis concluded the same thing. The Gambinos were operating more efficiently than ever, yet no one could find strings. There were no recorded meetings, no phone calls, no wires that captured incriminating words. He's like vapor, one agent said. You know he's there because everything moves around him, but you can't grab him. It was the perfect description. Domenico wasn't trying to outsmart the law. He had outgrown it. His empire thrived not because it was invisible, but because it was ordinary. The family had become part of the city's bloodstream. Its construction contracts, its shipping lanes, its real estate investments. Politicians unknowingly shook hands with his frontman. Bankers approved loans for businesses under his influence. Even unions, once corrupted through threats and violence, now worked with a quiet efficiency born from fear and respect. There was no need for guns or threats anymore. The system itself worked for him. Domenico understood what his predecessors never had. The best criminal is the one who never looks like one. He also understood time better than anyone. Most bosses wanted to be remembered. Domenico wanted to be forgotten. His power wasn't meant to last in headlines. It was meant to last in structure. He often told his closest lieutenants that the goal wasn't to control the city today, but to make sure the family still existed tomorrow. "We don't own the streets," he once said. "We own the silence between them." It became a kind of mantra within the family. He wasn't leading an army. He was curating a legacy. Yet even empires of silence have cracks. Domenico's strength, his discipline, his detachment, also created distance. The men who served under him revered him, but didn't truly know him. They followed his word because they believed in his myth. And myths, by nature, are lonely. His inner circle had shrunk to only a handful of trusted figures, men who had proven their loyalty through decades of restraint. He spoke little, trusted less. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. In his world, trust was a luxury no longer affordable. In private, he was almost monastic. He rose early, kept his routine the same every day. Black coffee, a walk through the neighborhood, a quiet breakfast, often alone. He read Italian newspapers, keeping an eye on Palermo and the whispers of Sicilian politics. He never forgot where he came from. Sicily was still in his blood. The smell of the sea, the old code of respect and vengeance, the lessons of the land that raised him. He knew that no matter how much America changed, the roots of the Mafia would always be Sicilian. He saw himself as the last true bridge between the two worlds, the living embodiment of that old code. When journalists tried to write about him, they found nothing to grab onto. No photographs, no flashy homes, no mistresses, no outbursts. One writer described him as a shadow on a fogged window. He existed, but only barely, and that was by design. He understood that in a world obsessed with identity, anonymity was the greatest armor. The more the public wanted to know who he was, the less they could find. Even within organized crime, he had become something rare, an invisible leader in a world of loud men. But even the quietest dawn cannot escape attention forever. In 2017, rumors began to surface about renewed FBI interest in the Gambino family. Technology had given the Bureau new weapons, data tracing, encrypted messaging analysis, surveillance drones. They wanted one last victory, one final unraveling of the myth that the Mafia had survived the 21st century. And once again, Domenico's name appeared in their reports, not as a direct target, but as the immovable obstacle. They knew that to dismantle the modern Mafia, they had to bring down the man who had taught it how to vanish. But Domenico was decades ahead of them. He had built an empire designed not around individuals, but systems. Even if he disappeared, the structure would endure. His strategy wasn't reaction, it was anticipation. He didn't try to fight technology, he used its weaknesses. He understood that digital surveillance was a net too wide. If you moved slowly enough, carefully enough, you could slip through the gaps. His orders were passed through intermediaries who didn't even know they were delivering messages. He relied on the oldest tools in the world: loyalty, respect, and time. The FBI couldn't record what wasn't said. They couldn't arrest a man who never appeared to do anything illegal. Inside the family, the legend grew. Domenico was seen less in public, but felt more than ever. His name was invoked like a spell. Disputes were settled by asking, "What would Dom do?" That question carried weight. It wasn't about violence or revenge. It was about restraint. Even the younger soldiers, impatient as they were, began to understand that their survival depended on his methods. He had turned silence into a culture. But time, even for men like him, is not an ally forever. By his 70s, Domenico had begun to slow physically. He walked more deliberately, spoke less, stayed home longer. Yet his mind remained sharp. He was still the quiet eye in the storm, the unmovable presence that held the family together. There was talk of transition, whispers about who would succeed him, but none of it reached him directly. He didn't engage in speculation. He had spent a lifetime preparing the family to function without him. The structure was the legacy. Whether his name remained attached to it or not didn't matter. The silence would continue. Those close to him said that in his later years, he became almost reflective, not remorseful. Men like him didn't deal in regret, but aware of the cost. He had survived longer than anyone expected, outlived the headlines, the wiretaps, the betrayals. But survival had its own kind of loneliness. He had traded human connection for control, and now, surrounded by a city that no longer feared him but still obeyed his unseen presence, he sometimes looked like a man carrying the weight of his own endurance. He once told a confidant, "The thing about silence is that after a while, it starts to echo." It was a rare moment of introspection. Perhaps he was beginning to feel what all great tacticians eventually feel, that every victory, stretched long enough, begins to look like exile. But if he felt the burden of that truth, he never showed it. He still attended quiet Sunday dinners with his few remaining allies. Still nodded politely to shopkeepers who had no idea who he really was. Still sat in his favorite cafe, watching the city move without him. By the end of the decade, the Gambino family, under Domenico Cefalù, had achieved something no one thought possible. They had outlasted everyone. While other families crumbled under indictments, informants, and infighting, the Gambinos endured, disciplined, stable, and profitable. The FBI had shifted its focus elsewhere, chasing newer crimes, newer faces. They had declared victory over the Mafia so many times that even they seemed tired of repeating it. And yet, somewhere in Brooklyn, an old Sicilian man drank his espresso and smiled faintly at the irony. His empire wasn't carved in gold or blood. It was built in patience. Every quiet decision, every careful retreat, every moment he refused to speak had added another layer to his invincibility. The world might forget his name, but it would live inside the systems he had shaped. The unions, the companies, the subtle loyalties that stitched the city together in ways no one could trace. All of it bore his unseen fingerprints. That was his masterpiece. In a world where men had shouted their names into history, Domenico Cefalù had done the opposite. He erased his name from it, and, in doing so, became immortal. His empire wasn't the kind you could point on a map or read about in a book. It existed in the spaces between things, in the silence between words, in the pauses between actions. He had once said, years earlier, when he was still a soldier in someone else's shadow, that the strongest man in the room was the one who could wait the longest. Now, at the height of his power, he had proven it. He had waited through wars, arrests, betrayals, and generations of change, and in the end, when the city's noise had devoured every other boss, only his silence remained. And somewhere deep inside the structure he'd built, in the quiet hum of money and loyalty that still flowed unseen through New York, Domenico Cefalu's empire lived on. Not loud, not celebrated, but eternal. The quiet Don's rule wasn't about conquering the world. It was about surviving it. And in that, he had succeeded in the only way that ever mattered. Chapter 11. The Legacy of Silence. It's strange how power fades, not with a scream or a fall, but with a whisper that lingers long after the man himself has stepped away. By the early 2020s, Domenico Cefalù had become something almost mythological, even within the circles that once feared his name. He was less a person now and more a presence, an invisible current that shaped the tides without ever appearing on the surface. The quiet Don had led the Gambino family through the most turbulent decades in modern organized crime. Yet somehow, he'd managed to outlive the chaos that had consumed every other generation. The FBI called it a miracle of discipline. His men called it destiny. But Domenico called it what it was, survival through silence. He had built an empire on restraint, and in that restraint, he found something that resembled peace. But peace, in the underworld, is never permanent. It's borrowed time, measured in years of quiet, and broken by moments of reckoning. And as the years passed, even Domenico began to feel the weight of that ticking clock. Age had slowed his body, but not his mind. His eyes still held the same sharp focus that had once intimidated prosecutors and rival bosses alike. Yet when he looked out the window of his Brooklyn home, he saw a world he barely recognized. The mafia of his youth, the one that had been governed by loyalty and codes, not technology and greed, was almost gone. In its place stood something noisier, sloppier, less disciplined. And for the first time in his life, Domenico wondered if silence alone could protect the world he'd spent decades preserving. He rarely left his neighborhood anymore. The city moved faster than he wanted to. Cameras were everywhere. Phones, drones, surveillance on every corner. To a man like him, that kind of world felt claustrophobic, not because it was dangerous, but because it was loud. The noise of modern life was the opposite of everything he believed in. He had spent his life mastering invisibility, and now invisibility had become impossible. Still, he adapted, the way he always had. He kept his routines small and predictable. Morning espresso at the corner cafe, a walk through the same street, polite nods to shopkeepers who had no idea who he was. He looked like an old man from another time, someone the city had forgotten. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Inside, however, he still pulled the strings that mattered. His influence hadn't faded. It had evolved. Younger men, ones who had never met him in person, still operated under the quiet systems he had built. They might not have known the details of his life, but they followed his rules. No unnecessary violence, no media attention, no weakness in the face of law enforcement. They called it the Cefalu doctrine, a way of operating that kept the Gambino family alive while others collapsed under greed or carelessness. His silence had become a blueprint. Even as he retreated from public life, Domenico kept his ears open. Information flowed to him through trusted intermediaries, old lieutenants, longtime associates who understood that every word spoken in his presence was sacred. He didn't need to attend meetings anymore. His approval was delivered through subtle gestures, often through nothing more than a nod or a brief silence on the phone. His guidance remained the heartbeat of the family, though few ever heard it directly. The FBI had stopped trying to pin him down. There were no tapes, no photos, no evidence. It was as if the man they'd spent half a century watching had simply evaporated into the air. And in a way, he had. His family, the real one, not the organization but the bloodline, had always been distant. He had never married, never had children. Some said it was by choice, others by necessity. To him, the Gambino family had always been enough, the only allegiance he could trust. But in quiet moments, sitting alone in the dim light of his living room, he sometimes thought about what it would have been like to have something ordinary, a family dinner, laughter, the warmth of connection without consequence. Then he would shake the thought away. Ordinary life was not meant for men like him. The mafia didn't just take your freedom, it took your right to simplicity. He had seen every kind of man rise and fall. Loud ones, ambitious ones, cruel ones. Men who thought they could outtalk fear, outshoot fate, outsmart history. They all ended the same way, dead, disgraced, or forgotten. But Domenico's path had been different. He had never chased wealth or worship. His life was not about winning. It was about enduring. He had turned survival itself into an art. Every time someone underestimated him, every time the world forgot his name, he became stronger. The less they saw, the more control he had. He had discovered the one truth that had eluded everyone else. Power that must be seen is already dying. By the time he entered his 70s, Domenico's empire no longer needed him to function. That was his greatest achievement and his deepest sorrow. He had created something self-sustaining, a network of quiet men who had learned to exist without his direct hand. The family had become a reflection of him. Calm, disciplined, efficient. But it also meant that the world no longer revolved around him. The city he had once ruled through whispers no longer required his guidance to obey his rules. It was a strange kind of immortality, one that came with invisibility. He had built a legacy so effective that it made him unnecessary. Still, he was not forgotten. Among the old guard, his name carried a sacred weight. They spoke of him as the last true Don, the last man who understood what Cosa Nostra was meant to be before it became corrupted by vanity. Younger generations who had only heard stories treated his life like scripture. To them, he was a relic from a purer time, a reminder that leadership didn't require theatrics, that true strength came from self-control. They quoted his lines the way priests quoted scripture. Silence doesn't protect you from death. It protects you from dying before you have to. But not everyone saw him as a saint. In law enforcement circles, he was still a ghost story. Analysts who had studied him for decades spoke of him with frustration. He doesn't exist in our system, one FBI agent said in an interview. He's a name without a footprint. The man leaves no heat signature. They compared him to a chess player who had already won before his opponent realized the game had started. Others called him dangerous, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The proof that old-world discipline could still defeat modern surveillance. There was one night, in the winter of 2021, when Domenico's old lieutenant came to visit him. The man, gray-haired and worn down from years of careful living, told him that the younger generation didn't understand anymore. They were reckless, impulsive, careless with their words and their phones. They don't know what silence costs, the lieutenant said. Domenico listened, nodded, and after a moment, said softly, "They'll learn. The world teaches faster than I ever could." It was not a threat, not even advice, just observation. He had lived long enough to know that lessons in this life always came with consequences. The years continued to peel away quietly. Domenico's walks grew shorter, his circle smaller. Yet his influence remained untouched. His empire ran on autopilot, guided by principles he had planted decades earlier. He no longer had to enforce silence. It had become instinct. Even when men he'd never met made decisions in his name, they did it the way they imagined he would approve, with restraint. His name, even unspoken, carried the weight of expectation. The FBI occasionally tried to test him. They'd send informants fishing for quotes, for reactions, for anything that could be twisted into evidence. But they always came back empty-handed. Domenico didn't react. He didn't need to. He'd spent a lifetime mastering the art of the non-response. One former agent summed it up perfectly. "He's the only man I ever investigated who didn't just refuse to talk. He made you feel like talking would be disrespectful." That was the aura he carried until the end. As the city changed, so did the underworld. Technology replaced handshake deals. Crime became decentralized, fragmented. The traditional families no longer ruled as they once had. But in the quiet corridors of legitimate business, Domenico's methods lived on. Construction magnates, importers, financiers, all connected through invisible threads. They might not have called themselves mafia anymore, but the blueprint was unmistakable. The Sicilian system had adapted, and its quiet king was still its invisible architect. Even in his solitude, he never let himself believe he was invincible. Age had taught him humility. He knew that one day, the silence he had built would outlast him. That was the plan. The point of power, to him, was not to be remembered, but to ensure continuity. He once told a confidant, "When the world stops saying your name, that's when you've finally done it right." He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to disappear into the structure he'd created, to become part of the silence he worshipped. And that's exactly what happened. The last confirmed photograph of Domenico Cefalù was taken around 2022, a blurred image of an older man in a dark coat, crossing a street in Brooklyn with his head slightly bowed, as if the weight of decades pressed on his shoulders. It wasn't dramatic, just human. A quiet moment in the life of a man who had spent his entire existence avoiding moments altogether. After that, he simply vanished. Some said he retired to Sicily, back to the village of his birth. Others whispered he'd passed away quietly in New York, buried under a different name in an unmarked grave. Law enforcement never confirmed it. There was no funeral, no obituary, no headlines. He disappeared the same way he had lived, without a sound. The family he built didn't mourn publicly. They didn't speak his name. They just kept moving, quietly, the way he had taught them. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was sacred. Today, His name still circulates in the undercurrents of both Sicily and New York. Older men say his story is proof that the mafia never truly dies. It just learns to whisper better. Younger ones call him a myth, a ghost from an era that will never return. But whether myth or memory, his influence lingers in every quiet deal, every unspoken agreement, every man who chooses silence over spectacle. The world may have forgotten Domenico Cefalù, but the underworld never will. He didn't conquer with bullets or charisma. He conquered with patience. He didn't seek to be remembered, yet his silence echoes louder than any boss who ever shouted. That's the paradox of his legacy. In a world where everyone wants to be heard, he proved that the loudest voice belongs to the man who never speaks. The quiet Don's empire still breathes through those who learned from him, through the structure he left behind, through the philosophy that silence isn't weakness, it's power in its purest form. And somewhere, whether in memory or myth, Domenico Cefalù remains exactly where he's always been, in the shadows, watching, waiting, unseen. Chapter 12. The Last of the Old Sicilians. The winter air in Brooklyn carried a kind of silence that only the old city seemed to remember, thick, heavy, and full of stories that no one dared to tell anymore. Somewhere in that silence, behind the dim light of a small apartment window, sat Domenico Cefalù, the last of the old Sicilians. The quiet Don, the man who had outlived his enemies, his allies, and his time. The city outside had moved on. Its streets now belonged to a different breed, its shadows illuminated by the glow of screens instead of the hush of whispers. But for Domenico, nothing had really changed. The faces were different, the methods faster, but the rules of survival remained the same. Silence still ruled the night. Loyalty still had a price. And time was still the only undefeated boss. He was in his late 70s now, thinner but not frail, his posture still deliberate, his gaze still sharp enough to cut through pretense. He moved like a man who carried the weight of entire decades on his shoulders, yet refused to let it bend him. His neighborhood barely noticed him anymore, and that was how he preferred it. He was just another old immigrant to the people who passed him on the street, another ghost fading into the background of a city that had long since forgotten how to recognize legends. But in the circles that mattered, his name still carried weight, a whisper that commanded respect, even if it was followed by silence. In his youth, Domenico had believed that power was about control, about keeping your hand steady while everyone else trembled. Now, in the twilight of his life, he understood that true power was something quieter. It was about stillness, about knowing when not to move, when not to speak. He had spent a lifetime mastering that art, and it had made him untouchable. While other bosses had been taken down by hubris or greed, by wiretaps or betrayal, Domenico had simply waited. The world around him burned itself out, and when the smoke cleared, he was still standing. Not louder, not prouder, just there. But even kings of silence are not immune to time. His empire had long since evolved into something that no longer required his hand. The men who ran things now were distant, detached, digital. They didn't meet in basements or diners or backrooms anymore. Their empires existed in data, not streets. It was a new kind of Cosa Nostra, cold, efficient, unromantic. Domenico didn't resent it, but he didn't admire it either. He saw it for what it was, survival disguised as innovation. The code had shifted from whispers to encryption, but the principles were the same. Money, loyalty, secrecy. Only the tools had changed. He still had visitors sometimes, old associates, former lieutenants who came more out of reverence than business. They brought him news, not requests. They updated him on how the family was doing, how the city was changing. Domenico would listen, nodding occasionally, rarely interrupting. He didn't offer advice unless asked, and even then, he spoke in riddles. The quieter a man becomes, he told one visitor, the more he can hear. It was the kind of phrase that stayed with people, the kind that could be interpreted 100 different ways. That was his gift. He didn't give orders anymore. He gave lessons that echoed long after he was gone. Law enforcement had all but stopped watching him. The newer agents didn't even know who he was. To them, he was a name in an old file, a photograph buried in a box somewhere. The older ones, the ones who remembered, spoke of him with reluctant respect. "He's the last one who never cracked," one retired FBI agent said in an interview. Every single guy from that era flipped, bragged, or died. Cefalu just stayed quiet. Another called him the ghost of the old mafia, the man who proved that invisibility was the strongest armor in a world obsessed with visibility. But inside that small apartment, the legend wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about the noise. The city that used to hum now buzzed. Every sound felt artificial, every silence temporary. He missed the old rhythm of things, the footsteps on pavement, the rustle of coats, the soft exchanges between men who said everything without saying anything. He missed the human part of it, the eye contact, the trust, even the tension. The new generation, with their texts and their digital ledgers, would never know what it meant to look another man in the eye and decide, wordlessly, whether he lived or died. That loss, to Domenico, was the end of something sacred. He thought often of Sicily in those days, of the smell of olive trees after rain, of the way the sea looked before dawn, black and endless. That was where he'd first learned what silence meant. In Sicily, silence wasn't just strategy, it was survival. It was a language. It was the air you breathed if you wanted to live past 20. Every gesture there meant something. Every pause was loaded with meaning. When he left for America in the late 1970s, he brought that silence with him like a second skin. And even now, after a lifetime spent in the shadows of New York's underworld, it still defined him. He could never shake it, and he didn't want to. It was all he had left that was pure. Sometimes he would take the subway just to feel the city move beneath him. He'd sit quietly, surrounded by strangers who didn't know they were sharing space with one of the last living architects of the old mafia. He'd watch them scroll through their phones, oblivious to everything around them. And he'd think about how different things were when information had weight, when secrets mattered, when every word could cost you your life. The world had traded fear for convenience, and Domenico knew that men had lost something important. People talk too much now about everything. He had built his empire on the opposite principle. The less they know, the longer you live. He wasn't bitter about the passing of time, but he carried a kind of quiet disappointment. The code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, had once been the foundation of his entire world. Now it was just a relic, something people mentioned in movies or documentaries without understanding what it meant. Omerta wasn't about fear of the law. It was about respect. It was about the belief that words were sacred, that what was said could never be unsaid. Domenico had lived his life by that rule, and even as the world mocked it as outdated, he knew it was the only reason he had survived. He never wrote anything down, never left behind letters or memoirs. He knew better than that. The modern world was obsessed with confession, with turning every life into a story, every secret into entertainment. Domenico wanted no part of it. He wasn't interested in being remembered, only in being understood by those who mattered. And the few who did understand him never needed words. They knew that everything he'd built, every quiet empire, every patient decision, every unspoken loyalty, was his legacy. He didn't need monuments. His silence was monument enough. In his later years, Domenico found himself thinking often about the men who hadn't made it, the ones who couldn't control their pride, their anger, their voices. He remembered John Gotti's laugh echoing through courtrooms, the headlines that made the mafia look glamorous and doomed all at once. He thought about the ones who'd betrayed the code for lighter sentences, for safety, for fame. To him, they were ghosts too, but the kind that haunted themselves. He had never envied their noise. The more they talked, the faster they disappeared. Silence was slower, but it lasted. One afternoon, as the sun filtered weakly through his window, a young man came to see him, a distant relative, curious about the family's past. The boy was nervous, unsure whether to speak freely. Domenico poured him coffee, the same way he had done for associates decades earlier, and listened to his questions about the old days. The The boy wanted stories, drama, names. But Domenico gave him none of that. He spoke instead about patience, about the importance of watching more than acting, of understanding that not all power looks like power. The boy nodded politely, probably disappointed. He wouldn't understand until much later that he had just been handed the essence of everything Domenico had ever been. The city around him was no longer his, but it still bowed to his shadow. Construction firms, ports, and unions still operated with quiet efficiency, guided by men who didn't even know the origin of their discipline. The habits he had instilled had become institutional. It was no longer called a mafia. It was just the way business was done. That was his true victory. He had erased the name, but kept the power. Every once in a while, Domenico would catch his reflection and barely recognize it. The years had thinned him out, carved lines across his face, dulled the sharp edges. But his eyes, those same Sicilian eyes, still carried the same depth. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything: violence, betrayal, greed, survival, and somehow walked through it without losing his center. There was no pride in them, just calm acceptance. He had lived exactly as he intended, quietly, deliberately, on his own terms. There's a saying in Sicily that when a man dies, the earth remembers his footsteps. Domenico had made sure his would be impossible to trace. There would be no funerals with bodyguards in dark suits, no news articles dissecting his life, no sensational trials or confessions. When the time came, he would simply vanish, the way a shadow disappears when the light changes. That was the only ending that made sense for a man like him. In the last months of his life, the few who still saw him said he was at peace. He smiled more often, though faintly. He spent long hours by the window, watching the city move below him, the noise of it softened by distance. One visitor asked him if he ever wished he'd done anything differently. Domenico paused, sipped his coffee, and said, "I did everything the way it needed to be done." That's all a man can say. It wasn't arrogance, it was closure. When he finally passed, no one knew. There was no announcement, no service. The world didn't even notice. But in the underworld, in those quiet rooms where men still spoke carefully and thought twice before answering a question, his absence was felt like a change in air pressure. They didn't say his name, but they felt the silence he left behind. And in that silence, his presence lived on. He was the last of the old Sicilians, the last to live and die by the code that once ruled the world's most secret empire. A man who proved that true power doesn't need to be seen, that the loudest sound in the room will always fade, but silence, true silence, echoes forever. Domenico Cefalù had no statues, no headlines, no gravesite for admirers to visit. But he didn't need any of that. He had achieved something far rarer. He had turned himself into a myth that no one could quite prove existed, and in doing so, he had become eternal. In the end, the world forgot his face, but the shadows never did. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the city he once ruled, the old lessons still guide those who understand. Speak little, move less, listen always, and above all, survive. That was the legacy of Domenico Cefalù, the quiet dawn, the last of the old Sicilians. The man who turned silence into history, and history into silence again. Chapter 13. The Fade into Legend. By the time the world realized Domenico Cefalù was gone, he had already become something else. Less man, more myth. His absence didn't make headlines. There were no sirens, no mourning processions, no crowds gathering outside funeral homes. There was only a quiet shift, like the city itself had exhaled and didn't know why. The people who mattered knew, of course. A few words passed between them in bars and backrooms, always low, always coded. "He's gone," someone would whisper, and the other would just nod. Nothing more needed to be said. In life, he had been the last man of silence. In death, he became silence itself. It was fitting in a way. The man who had lived invisible deserved an invisible exit. No photographs of a coffin, no obituary dissecting his life. Just disappearance. the same weapon he had used all his years to stay one step ahead of the world. Some said he died peacefully in his sleep, his final breath fading into the same quiet he'd spent his life cultivating. Others claimed he'd gone back to Sicily, to the land that first taught him the art of secrecy, to die where he was born. No one really knew, and that was exactly how he wanted it. To leave no trail, to vanish without ceremony. That was the last commandment of the old code. But absence has a way of creating its own kind of presence. For weeks, the underworld hummed with unspoken reverence. Men who had never met him toasted to his name in whispers. Younger ones, too young to have known the man himself, spoke about him like a legend, half history, half ghost story. They said he was the last boss who truly lived by the old code, the last one who understood that the less you're seen, the longer you survive. His death, if it could be called that, wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. Domenico Cefalù had ceased to exist, and in doing so, he had ensured that he would never really die. In the years that followed, stories began to grow around him like vines on a grave no one could find. Each one different, each one a reflection of what people needed him to be. To the older men, he was a saint of silence, a man who had restored honor to a world that had forgotten what it meant. To the younger ones, he was a puzzle, a symbol of the kind of control they would never achieve in an age that demanded visibility. They tried to emulate him, to speak less, to move slower, to remember his discipline. But they lived in a world that punished invisibility. Domenico's way of life belonged to another century, one where the greatest crime was speaking too soon. The FBI still kept a file on him, though most of its pages were blank. They never officially closed it. Maybe they couldn't bring themselves to. For decades he had been the unsolved equation in their world, a man who played by rules they didn't understand. He never fought them. He never fled. He simply refused to exist in their language. To the Bureau, he was a ghost that defied documentation. The final line in the file was written by an agent who had retired years earlier. If he's gone, he took half a century of secrets with him, and none of us will ever know what they were. It was true. No one knew the full extent of what he had built. His empire wasn't measured in cash or territory. It was built in influence, in networks that were so quiet they could only be felt, never seen. Construction, unions, trade, shipping, all the old industries he once controlled continued to move like clockwork. No one spoke of ownership, but the old patterns were still there. Men still deferred to invisible authority, still made decisions as if someone unseen was watching. And perhaps, in a way, someone was. His systems had outlived him. The discipline he imposed had become habit. The silence he demanded had become culture. In the streets of Bensonhurst, old-timers still told stories in half-sentences. They'd lean back in their chairs of the cafe, sip their espresso, and speak as if recalling a saint. He wasn't loud. One would say, didn't have to be. You felt him when he walked in the room. Another would nod. Didn't need bodyguards. The whole neighborhood was his guard. Then the talk would fade, replaced by long pauses, the kind of respectful silence that said more than words ever could. That was his legacy, the atmosphere he left behind, a kind of reverence that didn't need explanation. He wasn't the kind of legend who inspired fear through violence. He inspired it through absence. In a world where men had shouted themselves into ruin, he had whispered himself into immortality. The younger bosses who rose after him tried to modernize, to bring the families into the digital age. They built networks through encrypted apps, ran operations through offshore accounts, and called it evolution. But, deep down, even they knew they were imitating something they couldn't replicate. The foundation of what they built, the restraint, the order, the patience, was still his. They were operating on the bones of the world Domenico had created, even if they didn't understand the code that held it together. Every time they told their men to keep quiet, every time they avoided the cameras or the headlines, they were echoing him. He had changed the mafia not by reshaping it, but by reminding it of what it had forgotten. That crime wasn't about glory. It was about control. That power wasn't about volume. It was about consistency. That leadership wasn't about being feared. It was about being remembered in whispers. Domenico's greatest victory was not surviving law enforcement or betrayal. It was surviving relevance. He outlasted the age of spectacle and became something rarer, a man who didn't need to be remembered to remain eternal. There were rumors that somewhere in Palermo, a small gravestone bore no name, just a single line carved into the stone. He kept the code. No one ever confirmed it, and perhaps no one ever would. But the idea of it, the image of a nameless grave holding the man who had defined secrecy itself, felt perfect. In life, he had erased himself from records. In death, he erased even his name. To those who understood the code, that was not tragedy. It was transcendence. Even the city itself seemed to remember him. The ports still moved quietly at night. Trucks still changed hands without paperwork. Contractors still nodded across tables without speaking a word. His fingerprints had been wiped from history, but his structure remained in everything unseen. That was his genius. He didn't build monuments. He built rhythms. And once a rhythm becomes part of a city, it can never truly die. There was a story that circulated among the older soldiers, one last myth about Domenico. They said that a few weeks before his death, he met one final time with his oldest friend, a man who had been with him since the early days. They sat together for hours in a small apartment, the blinds drawn, the light low. No one knew what they talked about, but when his friend was asked later, he said only this: "He told me he was ready to disappear." And I believed him. Whether that story was true or not didn't matter. It fit him perfectly. Domenico had always understood that disappearance wasn't defeat. It was the final act of mastery. The Mafia historians who studied his life called him an anomaly. They couldn't categorize him. He didn't fit the mold of the flamboyant American dons, nor the brutal Sicilian capos who ruled through fear. He was something else, a fusion of patience and precision, a man who could see the entire board but never touched the pieces directly. They wrote papers, gave lectures, debated his methods, and yet none of them truly understood the simplicity of it. Domenico hadn't been a mystery. He had been a mirror. The world just never knew how to look quietly enough to see him clearly. As the years passed, his story began to blend with folklore. People claimed he'd been seen in Sicily, walking the narrow alleys near Palermo. Others swore he'd been spotted in Brooklyn, older but unmistakably him, sitting alone at a cafe. It didn't matter if any of it was true. The stories kept him alive, and maybe that was the point. Every myth starts with a man who disappears well enough to make people keep looking. In the end, Domenico Cefalù didn't need history to write his legacy. He had already written it in the way men spoke, in the way they hesitated before breaking the silence, in the way fear had transformed into respect long after his death. Every unrecorded conversation, every deal sealed without a word, every act of restraint that kept the underworld alive, all of it was his echo. He had turned silence into a living thing, and it breathed through generations that never even knew his face. In Palermo, the old men who still remembered him from before he left for America spoke of him rarely. When they did, it was in the way Sicilians talk about storms that changed the coastline, inevitable, unforgettable, and impossible to explain. He had the patience of the earth, one said, and the memory of the sea. They meant it as the highest form of respect, because in Sicily, those are the only two things that never truly disappear. The Gambino family, years after his passing, continued to operate like a shadow machine. Not the empire of the past, but something leaner, smarter, quieter. It was no longer about control. It was about balance. That was Domenico's doing. He had left them a map not of expansion, but of endurance. The younger bosses followed it, sometimes unknowingly, guided by the ghost of his order. Every choice they made not to speak, not to act, not to show, they made in his image. And so the man who never wanted to be remembered became impossible to forget. His silence had outlasted every wiretap, every investigation, every informer. The agents who once chased him retired and told stories about the one they never caught. the man who never raised his voice yet somehow commanded everything. To them, he was a riddle unsolved. To his men, he was the standard that none would ever reach again. Time, the great eraser, has a strange way of rewarding those who embrace it. The louder men of his generation faded faster, their noise swallowed by their own chaos. Domenico's quiet, however, aged like marble, unmoving, untouched. The legend of the Quiet Dawn became more than a story. It became a lesson, a warning, a philosophy, and maybe, somewhere in that invisible space between myth and memory, the old Sicilian smiled. Because this was the ending he had always planned. Not a fall, not a legacy carved in stone, but a fade so complete it became eternal. In a world that had spent decades trying to catch him, Domenico Cefalù had done the impossible one last time. He had vanished, and left his silence behind to rule in his place. That was his final act, not of defiance, not of power, but of poetry. The fade into legend. The man who built an empire without ever being seen, who spoke only when the world had forgotten how to listen, had written his own ending in the oldest language he knew. The language of stillness, the language of shadows, the language of silence. Chapter 14. Echoes of Power. Long after Domenico Cefalu's body had vanished into rumor and dust, his presence continued to move through the streets of New York like a ghost that refused to rest. You could feel it if you knew where to listen, not in the noise of sirens or headlines, but in the quiet exchanges at corner cafes, in the subtle nods between old men who carried history in their silence. The world had moved on, or at least thought it had. The Mafia, they said, was over. Broken, buried, irrelevant. But the city still breathed in patterns he'd designed. The Gambino family still operated with the rhythm he'd taught them. Slow, deliberate, invisible. Domenico's echo had become the blueprint for survival. He had not left instructions, not officially. There was no letter, no farewell, no whispered succession. Yet somehow, everyone seemed to know what he wanted. His rules had been burned into them over decades, not through threats or speeches, but through repetition, through example. The empire he built didn't need a successor. It was self-sustaining. And that was his genius. He had created a structure that could outlive the man who made it, one that thrived on absence rather than presence. The quieter the leadership, the stronger the system. Those who came after him didn't dare to imitate him directly. They couldn't. Domenico's kind of patience was born from another world, from the soil of post-war Sicily, from hunger and hardship, from an understanding that power was something you cultivated, not seized. The younger generation didn't have that in their blood. They'd grown up in a faster world, a world of surveillance cameras and instant messages, a world where invisibility was a burden, not a strategy. They respected him, but they didn't understand him. To them, his methods felt almost mythical, like an ancient code from a forgotten religion. And yet, even without fully understanding, they obeyed it. They ran the family as he would have wanted. Steady profits, no public violence, no unnecessary attention. They learned to disappear, not out of wisdom, but out of instinct. The ghost of Domenico was their compass, guiding them through a city that had learned to watch everything and understand nothing. Every time they hesitated before speaking, every time they chose patience over pride, they were unknowingly paying tribute to the man who had taught them that the quietest man in the room was always the most dangerous. The FBI still tracked the Gambinos, but even they admitted it wasn't the same. The new leadership didn't fit the old patterns. There were no flashy dons, no courtroom spectacles, no betrayals splashed across front pages. Everything was smaller now, cleaner, hidden behind legitimate business fronts. The Bureau called it the Cefalu effect, a generational shift from intimidation to invisibility. They couldn't dismantle it because they couldn't find it. It existed not in the traditional sense of organized crime, but as a web of influence, a culture of silence that had embedded itself into the city's DNA. Reporters tried, occasionally, to resurrect his story. They wrote think pieces and retrospectives, calling him the last quiet boss, the final architect of the Mafia's old soul. They speculated about his death, about his burial, about whether he had left hidden fortunes scattered across the globe. None of them ever got it right. They were looking for drama, and there was none to find. His life had been defined by what he didn't do, what he didn't say, didn't show, didn't reveal. The real story was the absence itself. He was proof that sometimes the most powerful narrative is the one without a visible ending. Among those who still spoke his name, it was always done softly, like prayer. The old men who'd served him carried a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. They knew what it meant to survive under his code. It wasn't easy. It required restraint in a world that rewarded impulse, humility in a culture addicted to ego. But it worked. They were still free, still wealthy, still invisible. Domenico had given them the one thing that mattered most, the ability to exist without exposure. That in their world was immortality. His methods even began to influence places beyond the Mafia. Corporate leaders studied his model without realizing it, adopting his principles in boardrooms and governments. Control perception, move without noise, let others take credit while you hold the strings. His way of thinking, patient, strategic, detached, had slipped into the bloodstream of modern power. The same silence that once ruled the backrooms of Brooklyn now governed the conference calls of Manhattan. No one said his name, but his logic lived on. And in Sicily, the whispers of his legacy lingered in their own way. In Palermo's narrow streets, in the old bars where men still drank espresso standing up, his story had become something closer to folklore. They called him l'uomo ombra, the shadow man, a figure of respect, not fear. The one who crossed the ocean and brought the Sicilian way back to life in America, not with violence, but with patience. Mothers used his name when warning their sons about arrogance. Be like Cefalu, they'd say. Think first, speak last. He had, without meaning to, become a symbol of something larger than crime. He represented endurance. In a century defined by noise and collapse, Domenico proved that stillness could win. That in a world obsessed with being seen, the true power belonged to those who could vanish at will. His story was not about glory. It was about the quiet art of staying alive. Still, legends are fragile things. Time wears them down, reshapes them, distorts them. By the late 2020s, most of the men who'd known him personally were gone. The next generation had only second-hand stories, bits and pieces, retold and exaggerated. Some thought he'd been a tyrant, others a philosopher. A few swore he'd retired to a monastery in southern Italy, living out his days in silent prayer. A retired detective claimed to have seen him once, years after his supposed death, stepping out of church in Palermo wearing a long coat and fedora, his face half hidden in shadow. Whether it was true didn't matter. It was exactly the kind of ending he would have written for himself. Even law enforcement, for all their skepticism, couldn't help but respect the perfection of his disappearance. It was, as one FBI agent put it, the cleanest exit we've ever seen. No witnesses, no paperwork, no closure, just a vanishing act that turned into a legend. They'd spent decades building cases against him and ended up with nothing but silence. In a strange way, it humbled them. For a man they'd tried so hard to expose, he'd managed to make them part of his mythology. They had become the storytellers of the man they never caught. In the city itself, traces of him still remained. The businesses he once touched continued to thrive quietly, their profits unremarkable but consistent. They weren't flashy, but they were steady, exactly the way he designed them. To outsiders, they looked ordinary. To insiders, they were reminders. The buildings, the docks, the restaurants, all pulsed with the same rhythm of controlled invisibility. Domenico had turned the city into his monument without anyone realizing it. There was one place in particular, a small Italian bakery in Bensonhurst, that people believed was his last refuge. The owner, an old friend of his from Sicily, never confirmed it, but once a year, on the same day, every January, he closed the shop for an hour at noon. He would lock the door, light a candle, and sit in silence. No customers, no employees, no music. Just quiet. When asked why, he always said the same thing. For a man who kept his word. No one pressed further. Domenico's name became shorthand for an ideal that had nothing to do with crime anymore. He represented control and chaos, clarity and noise. Businessmen invoked him when talking about discipline. Writers used him as a metaphor for legacy. His name appeared in novels and films, each version of him a little more mysterious than the last. But the real man had been simpler. He wasn't chasing greatness. He was running from exposure. He knew that history remembers the loudest voices, but it obeys the quietest hands. In the years after his death, the city's criminal landscape fractured. Without his guiding silence, ambition returned, and with ambition came noise. Younger bosses tried to reassert dominance, to reclaim the kind of public attention he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It never lasted. They rose fast, fell faster. The media called it the curse of the quiet dawn, a superstition born from truth. The moment the noise returned, the balance collapsed. Those who remembered Domenico's lessons saw it coming. The louder they get, one old capo said, the closer they are to disappearing. And he was right. Every man who defied the code of silence ended up exactly where Domenico had always known they would. In headlines first, handcuffs next, and graves soon after. Time, though, has its own rhythm. By the mid-2030s, the story of Domenico Cefalù had crossed generations. His name had become something more than history, a myth for men who lived in shadows, a parable for those who understood the difference between living and existing. His silence had become a kind of inheritance. Even in the new world, one run by algorithms, surveillance, and data trails, there were still those who followed his code, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for the oldest truth he'd ever taught, that the most dangerous thing in any room is the man who doesn't need to be noticed. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city fell briefly still, you could almost imagine him walking those streets again, older, slower, but still watching. The echoes of his power lived not in his name, but in the spaces between sounds, in the way a door closed gently instead of slamming, in the pause before conversation began, in the unspoken rules that still govern deals behind closed doors. Domenico Cefalu's world had faded, but its rhythm still beat softly, like a ghost heart buried deep beneath the asphalt. His story was never about crime. It was about endurance. He had outlasted every kind of enemy: time, law, vanity, even memory. And in doing so, he had achieved what every man in his world secretly desired but could never admit: to become untouchable, not because he was feared, but because he was forgotten. That was the paradox of Domenico's legacy. He vanished so completely that even in memory, he remained hidden. Yet his influence persisted, invisible but indestructible. The last of the old Sicilians had become the first of something new, a symbol of eternal restraint in a world that could no longer stop talking. His story wasn't told in noise or spectacle. It lived in the hum beneath the city, in the faint pulse of old systems still working exactly as he'd left them. Domenico Cefalù had taught generations of men how to survive without ever being seen. And in the end, that was the truest kind of power, the kind that doesn't fade, doesn't age, doesn't die. It just keeps echoing quietly through time, long after the man who created it has disappeared. And so, even now, when the lights of Brooklyn dim and the night grows heavy, the silence still feels familiar. It's not emptiness, it's inheritance. It's the lingering presence of a man who built his empire not out of noise, but out of the spaces between it. The city breathes, the world spins, and somewhere, in the invisible corners of power, Domenico Cefalù still waits, silent, steady, eternal. The echo that refuses to end. Chapter 15, The Immortal Code. The night in New York was quiet, too quiet for a city that claimed to never sleep. The skyline glittered like a crown of false stars, but underneath all that light, in the veins of the streets that twisted through Brooklyn, silence still reigned. It wasn't the kind of silence born of peace. It was the kind that carried weight, the kind that hid stories, debts, promises, and ghosts. It was the kind Domenico Cefalù had ruled with. Even years after his death, the city still followed his rhythm without knowing it. The rules he'd written in whispers continued to shape the lives of men who'd never met him. And that was his true immortality. The man was gone, but his code had outlived him. Every generation of the Mafia believed it was reinventing itself, but the truth was simpler. It was repeating him. Domenico's fingerprints were invisible, but everywhere. The careful way business was done, the soft way men spoke, the subtle patience behind every move, it was all his doing. His ghost didn't haunt the city, it managed it. Even in a new century where crime had gone digital and loyalty could be bought with encryption keys instead of blood, the same principle still applied. Silence was survival. Domenico had understood that silence wasn't just a weapon. It was a system, a living thing that fed on fear, loyalty, and discipline. And that system endured long after his heartbeat stopped. In the years following his disappearance, the Gambino family didn't collapse. It adapted. The men who came after him didn't have his presence, but they had his blueprint. They ran leaner, smarter, quieter. Gone were the days of flash, of rings and cigars and cameras flashing in courtrooms. No one wanted to be famous anymore. They wanted to be invisible. That was Domenico's greatest victory. He had reshaped ambition itself. To be unseen was to win. To be unknown was to rule. The FBI knew it too. They still monitored the family, still tapped phones, still ran operations. But the results were different now. There were no major takedowns, no big bosses falling in handcuffs. Every time they thought they were closing in on something, it dissolved into nothing. Legitimate companies, legal contracts, paper trails too clean to contest. The Bureau's reports became more confused, more speculative. No clear leadership structure, one memo read. Likely decentralized hierarchy modeled after Cefalu-esque governance style. Another described the phenomenon more poetically. It's as if he trained them to live without a heartbeat. You can't arrest a ghost. In a way, he had. Domenico never wanted his empire to depend on one man, not even himself. He'd seen too many dynasties crumble because of ego. Men who thought they were untouchable always ended up in cells, their names shouted by newspapers they used to despise. Domenico refused to make the same mistake. He'd built something that couldn't be killed because it didn't exist in one place. It was an idea, not an organization, a way of moving through the world. And ideas, real ones, don't die. They just change shape. Outside of law enforcement, the myth only grew stronger. Documentaries, books, podcasts, all of them tried to decode the man who had refused to leave a trace. But every story contradicted the next. Some claimed he'd been buried in a Sicilian cemetery under a false name. Others swore he'd died in New York, quietly, in an unmarked apartment surrounded by nothing but silence. One conspiracy suggested he never died at all, that he'd retired somewhere in South America, still pulling strings behind clean corporate fronts. None of it could be proven. Every version made him more mysterious, and every mystery made him larger. In Sicily, he was treated like a folk hero. The younger generation of locals, many of whom had never even been to America, spoke his name as if he were a legend from another time. He symbolized something deeper than crime. He represented identity. A man who had crossed an ocean, mastered a foreign empire, and done it without losing the essence of what made him Sicilian. Discipline, patience, the sacredness of silence. L'onor del silenzio, they called it, the honor of silence. That phrase became synonymous with his name. To live like Cefalu was to live with your soul guarded, your intentions hidden, your dignity intact. The code he lived by, the one older men still whispered about, was simple but absolute. Never speak when listening will serve you more. Never show when the unseen has greater power. Never fight battles that time can win for you. And above all, never forget that trust is currency, and silence is the only bank that never collapses. He had lived by those truths, not as strategy, but as faith. They had turned him from a man into a myth, and his myth into a mirror that outlasted his flesh. For all his restraint, Domenico hadn't been without emotion. Those close to him, very few, but loyal beyond question, remember a man who could see people's flaws without judging them. He had the patience of a priest, the mind of an architect, and the eyes of someone who had seen too much and learned when to stop looking. He was not cruel, but he understood cruelty. He was not sentimental, but he understood love, the kind of love that bound men together not through words but through shared silence. The men who had served under him didn't love him out of fear. They revered him because he made them better at surviving. He didn't promise them greatness. He promised them longevity. And in their world, that was the rarest gift of all. Time, however, spares no one. The generation that carried his lessons began to fade, replaced by men who only knew the myth, not the man. They quoted his words like scripture, but lacked the patience to live them. Some tried to modernize the code, to adapt silence to an age of exposure. But Domenico's teachings weren't made for half measures. Silence wasn't a tactic. It was a total commitment. And those who tried to use it without understanding it failed spectacularly. Their arrogance made noise. Their noise drew attention. And attention brought the same, and it always had. The newspapers returned, the cameras flashed, and the cycle of downfall began again. Still, even as others stumbled, there remained a core group of quiet men who never broke faith. They ran the docks, the unions, the contracts, always small, always discreet. They didn't boast or dream of titles. They didn't need to. They knew what Domenico had known, that the loudest victories are also the most fragile. Their success wasn't measured in wealth or territory, but in longevity. Keep working, keep breathing, one of them said. That's what he taught us. The rest is vanity. In the early 2030s, an old recording surfaced, a rare interview from the 1980s where a much younger Domenico was asked about what made a man powerful. The interviewer expected the usual bravado. Instead, Domenico smiled faintly and said, "Power is like wind. You can't hold it. You can only move with it. The moment you try to grab it, it's gone." The recording went viral online decades later, shared by people who had no idea who he truly was. It was ironic. The man who had spent his life avoiding attention became a digital prophet for a world drowning in noise. Quotes from him, some real, some fabricated, circulated on social media, turning him into a philosophical figure. The man who never spoke, they called him. The ghost philosopher. Even in misinterpretation, his silence had found a new way to speak. The Underworld, meanwhile, kept his code alive in its own quiet way. The rules he created had become unwritten law. You could walk into certain rooms in certain parts of the city, and the atmosphere would shift, the volume would drop, the words would weigh more, the glances would linger longer. That was his world still alive beneath the surface. Those who operated there didn't need to invoke his name. They were living inside it. His legacy reached beyond crime. It touched culture. Filmmakers used him as inspiration for antiheroes, men who commanded loyalty without a word. Philosophers cited him in essays about discipline and the illusion of control. Even politicians, when caught in scandals, quoted his philosophy about silence, as if it were a virtue they suddenly remembered. In a strange, poetic way, the man who had avoided the public eye his whole life had become a symbol for every person who wanted to escape the world's constant demand to be seen. But if you could somehow bring Domenico back and tell him all of this, he wouldn't have cared. Fame, myth, legacy, none of it had ever mattered to him. The only thing he ever valued was control, not over others, but over himself. That was the secret. Control the impulse, control the word, control the noise. Everything else follows. That was the heart of his immortality. Not power over the world, but mastery of the self. Somewhere, in an old cafe that had survived generations, there's still a table in the corner where he used to sit. The chair creaks the same way it always did. The owner never replaced it. Every year, a single espresso is placed there on his birthday. No name, no note, no ceremony. Just a gesture. The first time it was done, it was an act of memory. Now it's an act of ritual. Because men like Domenico don't need to be remembered. They need to be acknowledged. Quietly. And so his name, though barely spoken, continues to live. Not in songs or statues, but in pauses. In moments where men choose to listen instead of speak. In the space between question and answer. That's where Domenico Cefalù still exists. Not as a ghost, but as a rhythm. The immortal code he left behind continues to govern the shadows. It teaches the same lesson it always has. That noise burns itself out, but silence endures. He was the last of a breed that believed power wasn't about being followed, but about being felt. The kind of man who could enter a room and change its gravity without a sound. Even now, years later, that gravity hasn't lifted. His world may have faded, but the weight of his silence remains. And maybe that's the final truth of his story, the part that even history can't erase. Domenico Cefalù didn't die. He just became silence itself, the kind that lingers long after the last word has been spoken. And somewhere in that silence, between the heartbeat of the city and the hum of the streets, his code still whispers to those who understand. Patience over pride, restraint over rage, invisibility over infamy. The immortal code of a man who proved that in the end, it isn't the noise that lasts. It's the quiet that remains when the world has said everything it can. And in that quiet, the quiet dawn still reigns, eternal, unseen, unbroken.